morning and welcome to the Rainbow Push Coalition and Citizenship Education Fund's 24th Annual Wall Street Project Economic Summit. My name is Randall Pinkston and I will be your MC for this exciting two-day summit. Of course, we're coming to you virtually because of the pandemic. It has been 24 years since the Wall Street Project first challenged corporate America to end the multi-billion-dollar trade deficit with minority vendors and consumers. As its founder, the Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. so accurately noted, just as America did not realize how good professional sports could be until athletes of all colors could play, American business will not maximize its growth potential until all businesses have an equal opportunity to compete on an even playing field where the rules are public and the goals are clear. So, as we celebrate more than 2 decades of the Wall Street Project, we must remain diligent, particularly during these challenging times. Now, if you've attended the summit through the years, you will know that these next 2 days will feature industry leaders' information. Although this year's summit is truncated, it will still feature information you will not want to miss. Our summit theme this year, The Wall Street Dilemma 100 Years After Tulsa, focuses on the gaps in income, wealth, denial of access to capital, and true equal opportunity that still exist in the business community, commercial banks, investment banking, and the financial markets generally, and emphasizes why the work of the organization is vital and must continue. During this summit, we will address these issues and the steps we need to take moving forward. As always, we want to thank our wonderful sponsors. Although there was no charge for the summit, becoming a member of the Rainbow Push Coalition goes a long way in supporting the work of the organization. So please get informed, get inspired, get involved. Become a member by visiting www.rainbowpush.org/join. Now, please join me in giving the warmest welcome to our leader, the founder and president of Rainbow Push Coalition, Reverend Jesse L. Jackson Sr.
100 years after Black Wall Street, Wall Street was a thriving Black community. The Stratford Hotel, 54-room hotel. They had shops and haberdashers, food eateries, beauty shops, barber shops. They were a real thriving community. Then a Black man was accused of raping a white woman. They went to jail to see he was not railroaded. The whites reacted by burning down Wall Street. They burned it, killed out 300 people. Thousands were never recovered, never seen again. Mr. Stratford, the great-grandfather of John Rogers, owned the hotel and 20 other rental houses. A very vocal voice in the community standing for justice and decency. 5,000 blacks were lynched, killed. 200 agents, I might add. We suffered the pain of the absence of Wall Street. I think about Jack Johnson fighting during that period. He beat Jack Jeffries and there were race riots after he was winning a fight, beating a white man. Fights were untouchable by blacks during that season. We couldn't use a hotel, motel, public park, our library. We were locked out. Now, 2021, 100 years later, well, we have more power now. We must put a focus on economics. Stage one was to end legal slavery. 246 years, we were enslaved longer than we've been free. 70 years in legal Jim Crow, 54 decision led by Thurgood Marshall, Constable Baker Motley, and that group. Then the third stage is the right to vote. You can be out of slavery, have the right to vote, and still starve the access to capital, industry, and technology. Why don't we recognize, why don't we have our share of businesses? Because we cannot get the money. Where's the money? Well, university pension funds, corporate pension funds, state and government pension funds. The federal government has a huge pension fund bank. We need our share of capital. We need banks that will lend to us based on our needs and our capacities. We see in the marketplace imposition on us. Subjectively, loans are not made, just not made. So come to Wall Street this time around and look at what we're going to do. Our share of pension funds is enormous. One company has all the 401k, BlackRock in New York, for example. John Rogers is in that business of 401k. They're investment bankers. And John Rogers built a school, the Ariel School. We're investing more and more where we live. Banks red line and corporations red line, university red line, and we cannot grow behind the red line. We're going to green line the red line zone. We're going to, where do we go from here? We're going to put demands on business. Demands, I keep it on pension funds because it's just a source of money. I mean, workers invest in pension funds, and pension fund managers say where we live is not investment worthy. Take our money and vote against us economically. We're going to change that. This week, tune in and listen to business people talk about business. In every state, every city, we're going to talk about new commitment to business, economic opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now it's time to move on to our first session titled 100 Years Later, What History Teaches Us About Tulsa. Let's welcome the session's moderator, Dr. Benjamin R. Chavis, Jr., the President and CEO of the National Newspaper Publishers Association. Dr. Chavis.
Thank you. Welcome to this panel. And I first want to thank the Reverend Jesse Jackson for inviting us to participate in the 24th Annual Wall Street Project Economic Summit. I've known Reverend Jesse Jackson for a long time, appreciate his leadership as the founder and president of the Rainbow Push Coalition, and a longtime fighter for civil rights and human rights, and someone we all admire. And we thank him for the last 24 years doing this Wall Street project. Now today, I'm very pleased to have two distinguished panelists who will address the subject 100 years later, what history teaches us about Tulsa, that is Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was 100 years ago that we saw the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma destroyed. Today, economic indicators show a deepening Black and white economic inequality in the United States. African Americans are too much unbanked, and our financial literacy skills in many cases are minimal. We're not well versed in this history, particularly when it comes to economic conditions that are currently alive and well across the United States. This session will look back at the affluent community known as Black Wall Street, the Greenwood district in Tulsa in the early 1900s, where Blacks were rich in business and culture until its destruction by racism, by white supremacy, by systemic racism in 1921. And what can we learn from their success, and how does what happened 100 years ago apply today? I'm very pleased to have Dr. Rhonda Forche Sharp, president and founder of the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, and past president of the National Economic Association. Dr. Sharp, thank you for being with us. We also have Dr. Rashawn Ray, professor of sociology and the executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland, College Park, and the David Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Ray, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And this is a discussion between the three of us. We're going to get right into it. I want to ask Dr. Sharp first. Dr. Sharp, from all of what you know, tell us first about your Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race. I like the name of that. Tell us what this institute does.
So let me tell you first why I created it. And that is, when I would read reports about women, I didn't see myself. And if I did see myself, it would often be except, comma, Black women, and it was a deficit lens. So our mission is to expand women's focused research to include the needs of Asian, Black, Latino, Native American, multiracial women. I like to say that we ask the critical questions around the well-being of this group, and we advocate for using a micro-analysis approach. And what we mean by that is we want policymakers and scholars to disaggregate data beyond the banal race, gender, ethnicity, but to disaggregate data by the characteristics that we believe influence outcomes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I also want to say that for us, science is not STEM, although we do some STEM research. For us, science is a social science lens.
Very good, very good. Dr. Ray, tell us about what you do at the University of Maryland, College Park, and also as a distinguished fellow at the Brookings Institute. Tell us how sociology and data relate to our subject matter.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dr. Chavis. I mean, it's a pleasure to be here with you and Dr. Sharp, and definitely appreciate Reverend Jackson and Dr. Yeary and others who have invited us to be part of this event. What we do at the Lab for Applied Social Science Research is we aim to take social science research and data and be able to offer it in a way that can be disseminated to policymakers and the general public. The big thing that we've been working on over the past few years is an innovative virtual reality decision-making program for law enforcement. In short, what this is this is a virtual reality program where police officers put on virtual reality goggles. They are immersed into a virtual world with encounters that they have every single day: traffic stops, domestic violence house calls, dealing with people who have a mental health condition, dealing with robberies. And primarily what we do as sociologists and social psychologists is analyze police officers' behavior and the way that the people who they're interacting with influences their own behavior. We've developed well over 100 virtual reality scenarios at this point. We've worked with thousands of police officers across the country, dozens of police departments. And in short, what we find, it shouldn't be surprising to people, it'll be a part of what we talk about today as it relates to Tulsa, is that police officers exhibit anti-Black bias. But the interesting thing about it is that we can link their bias to their behavior. And more importantly, we can talk about what might increase that bias and what might decrease that bias. So experience can decrease that bias. More accountability can decrease that bias. When officers have less information, when they're rushing, when they're stressed, when they're hungry and tired, those sort of things can make bias go on steroids. So part of what we do is disseminate this information to policymakers and stakeholders across the country to improve police-civilian relationships.
Very good. Dr. Sharp, back in 1921, in Tulsa, Black-owned businesses that were owned by Black men, Black women, and whole Black families owned their businesses. What can we glean today? What can we learn from what happened 100 years ago in Tulsa, from your perspective?
So one of the things that I've taken some time to do is to go back and look at census data, because I was curious as I was reading the report that was done by the commission. I was curious about two things. There was value placed for property, but I didn't see value on life. And one of the ways that we can calculate that is looking at occupations of folks in Tulsa in 1920 and looking at earnings. Now, the unfortunate part was that the census did not collect data on earnings. So it is difficult to talk about. I believe there is a surgeon who they talk about being killed, can't place a value on his life because there isn't any information about what his earnings or what the earnings of a surgeon may have been. But what I did find in terms of looking at Tulsa and the impact of the massacre on that day is that you see a real decrease in the presence of Black men. And when I talk about a real decrease, so if we're talking about Black men who are between the ages of 16 and 24, we find that the decrease in their presence goes from about 9% of that age population to about 4%. And if we think about Black men and women in that age population, they were 20% of the population in 1920, and they're 12% of that population in 1930. And the reason I picked that age group is that that's the age when we start thinking about Black men really becoming a threat, right? And this is about a riot and a massacre that breaks out on the heels of a 19-year-old male. Right. And so the reason I bring that up is it's not just about what happens in terms of loss of property and loss of business, but when you have a community in which Black men are no longer in the community, it has implications for family structure. Right. And we know that that leads to a lot of the conversation that Rayshawn was talking about, interactions with police. It has implications for wealth when men are not in the community. So I think a lot of what we can see there is the changes in family structure and the implications for wealth that go beyond businesses.
Very good. Dr. Ray, systemic racism is a long-term problem in America. It just didn't happen after George Floyd or just didn't happen after Breonna Taylor, or the long list of African-American men, women, and children that have been murdered as a result of racism. From your sociological research and data, what can you tell us about, and what can we learn, and more importantly, from Tulsa as it applies to 2021?
Well, I mean, I think Dr. Sharp just hit the nail on the head, talking about people and property. I mean, we have to realize that in Tulsa, and both of you highlighted this, I mean, it was a thriving community. And when I say thriving, I mean, it was middle class, potentially upper class Black people doing what America told them to do. Be upwardly mobile, bring yourself up from your own bootstraps, establish businesses, own homes, value education. And they did that, and they were slaughtered for it. And when we talk about being slaughtered, I mean, when it comes to people, it's an estimated at least 300 people were killed on what's known as Black Wall Street in Tulsa and Greenwood, Oklahoma, across 35 blocks. We have to think about this. 35 blocks were destroyed. Those were businesses, those were homes, loss of property. We also have to realize that not only did people lose their businesses and their homes, but they then had to flee that area. And because of that, white people were able to claim that land that they did not own. So it was a trifecta of what Black people lost. And as you noted, Dr. Chavis, there's a legacy here. We have to think just a few years before, about 4 years before, we had the East St. Louis massacre, where about 6,000 Black people were homeless, 300 businesses were destroyed. I mean, a couple of years after Tulsa, we had Rosewood in Florida, where about 150 Black people, overwhelmingly high number of Black people died. And then also the town was destroyed. So across the country, we saw from Oklahoma to Florida to Missouri, Black cities and towns being destroyed. And that has a legacy in how we think about Jim Crow segregation, the fact that Black towns could be targeted because we had been segregated and steered into particular communities. And even overcoming that, many of us were still able to achieve and thrive and had that taken away from us. So we have to think about this legacy. Then when we start to talk about 2021 and what has happened 100 years since, has there been a lot of progress? Yes. But also there has been progress deferred and progress that's even reversed. And that's one of the things that we have to think about when it comes from a policy standpoint, that yes, we had Brown versus Board of Education. Yes, we had the Civil Rights Act. Yes, we had the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act. But along the way, over the past 4 to 5 decades, those legislations have been carved out, have been carved away and chopped up to where the impact of them is no longer there. And people are making assumptions that progress simply continues when we see systemic racism playing a role out in our society, everything from thinking about business ownership and the fact that currently during COVID, we know that Black businesses have been disproportionately less likely to receive PPP funding and also be able to sustain themselves. We know that there are huge disparities in healthcare and then obviously in policing. These same things were happening 100 years ago. And we also have to note that 100 years ago, lynching was basically at an all-time high, and basically almost the same rate that Black people were being lynched. And as Dr. Sharp said, overwhelmingly Black men, not saying Black women weren't. We know that Black women were, and we know that there were Latinos that were. We know there were some white people standing up for justice that were, but overwhelmingly it was Black people and Black men. That disproportionality is very similar to the gap in police killings that we see today.
I want to chime in here really quick
Sure.
and talk about something that I think in these conversations we don't talk about. And I'm sure we're going to get to it because it's sort of been on everyone's mind after we saw what we saw on January 6th, who gets to riot and who's protected. And I was having a conversation with Willeen Johnson, who's a retired economist from the New York Fed. And one of the things that she said to me is, when you repeatedly see these massacres that destroy Black wealth, Black communities who as Rayshawn has already said, have brought themselves up from their bootstraps and are thriving, that what lingers in the minds of folks is a fear to recreate that. is a fear to have businesses that are thriving, because history has shown that the state may not protect you, right? So we not only have a situation in which wealth is stolen then, but it is also depressed because there's this continual threat of violence if you are prosperous. Jacoba Williams, who is an economist at RAND, has done a lot of work around lynching. And she notes that if you look at counties and spaces where there was high lynching, you also find that Black folks are not voting. So I think that it is not just this notion of wealth and destroying the community, but it also has implication for future generations being prosperous and the ways in which people will participate in democracy when it's shown that the state won't protect you.
Absolutely. I'm a native of North Carolina, and in 1898, in November, the only successful coup d'etat in American history happened in a predominantly Black community of Wilmington, North Carolina, where hundreds were massacred, thrown into the Cape Fear River. A lot of families had to flee, left their land, left their businesses, and the government was taken over. So this insurrection that was attempted on January the 6th, 2021, had an antecedent also in the same situation. So Dr. Sharp and Dr. Ray, given the intersection of violence and race and the suppression of Black wealth when it's attempted, what does that have to say to us today about not only public policy and the data and the research, but forward looking? What recommendations would you have? I want to start with Dr. Sharp first. What should Black America do now, not only to attain wealth, but the history shows our progress has to be protected, because when we start prospering, they will come after you.
Yeah. So I'm happy to hear you say data, because one of the things that I have really been thinking about, not just in terms of disaggregating data, but also how we collect data. And I think that what a lot of people don't realize, and I had not thought about until someone brought it to my attention. Now, I've just been using census data because it was available and was free to do my studies. But census data, American Community Survey, these data sets are ways in which we can ensure civil rights. And the reason that I say that is because it is incredibly important that we as Black folks, first of all, fill out those surveys and we participate when folks are asking us about data. Data is how Rayshawn and I do our work, right? It is how policymakers can craft policies. The policies will only be as good as the data that is available. So if, as I said earlier, I want to see myself in the data. If we're not there, policies can be crafted to protect us from a policy perspective, but it also isn't there to hold folks accountable. So I like to think about, we want better data. We want us to be in the data. We then want us to use that data to hold people accountable, not just to ask us questions, and as some groups have said, do poverty porn, because they talk about us always from a deficit perspective. And I also want to encourage people to rethink this word disproportionate when we're talking about data. And I was saying to my mom the other night that I tweeted once during COVID, when they said it was a she session. And when you looked at the data, something like 8 million to 12 million women were white. And so I tweeted that it had disproportionately impacted white women. And someone tweeted, oh, I thought I knew what disproportionately meant. And I was like, you did, you do. You're just not used to seeing it associated with white. So I think that when we use the term disproportionately, it allows people to hear this does not impact them. So we really want to rethink the way we use that term. So I think that's one. One is going to be the ways that we think about data. I was part of the National Council on the Black-White Wealth Gap, which was put together by the Center for American Progress. And I think Derek Hamilton is the moderator for another session. And one of the things that we advocated for was more investment in HBCUs and Black researchers. So thinking about where cities where you have Black researchers for innovation around business. I'll stop there and then I'll come back a little bit after Rayshawn chimes in, but two of mine are data and then thinking about the ways we invest in HBCUs and more investment in Black researchers in sciences.
Very good. That's a good segue. Dr. Ray, also, Sheila Jackson Lee, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, and other members of the CBC have advanced HR 40, the bill on reparations. And just this past week, Evanston, Illinois, officially passed public policy to start what they define as reparations for the residents of Evanston, Illinois. So my segue question to you, Dr. Ray, is following on what Dr. Sharp said, the importance of data, not only data, but who does the data and how is the data aggregated and what is the analysis of the data? What do you say from your research perspective, Dr. Ray, on how Black people can not only learn from what happened in Tulsa 100 years ago, but how do we gather the right data done the right way and make the analysis so that we can come up with some solutions to how to build wealth in Black America from 2021 going forward?
Yeah, I mean, well, when it comes to data, I mean, one of the things that we've been seeing from social scientists, economists in particular, but also sociologists, is being able to quantify the impact of some of these mass events, whether they be thinking about Wall Street, even thinking about the legacy of slavery and the impact that that had. And one of my colleagues at Brookings, Andre Perry, one of the things that we did, we put together a report at Brookings to look at how we might think through reparations. And one of the things that we discovered is that if we say, look at 1860, Black people's bodies, just our bodies, we haven't got to the products we've created. We haven't got to the land that we worked on. That was free labor, mind you, just our physical bodies were worth $3 billion in 1860, $3 billion. That money was worth more than the railroads and the factories put together. We also know that Black people's bodies have been sold to establish the endowments of some major higher education institutions, like Georgetown, like those that are in the state of Virginia, like many others who haven't came forward to honor their legacy like these have, and to actually figure out a way forward. And then we know that in Evanston, Illinois, as you mentioned, that part of what they recently did is they passed legislation that ruled that individuals who are Black and from Evanston and they can trace their family lineage, that they are going to be able to qualify for housing grants. Now, in thinking through this, the bottom line is that we know that when we fast forward to today, and honestly, not even today, a couple of years ago, that the wealth gap was 10-1. In other words, white people had 10 times the amount of wealth that Black people did. That has to do with not only the legacy of slavery, but also what Ira Katz Nelson calls the Great New Deal, which is what he calls when affirmative action was white, thinking about New Deal policies related to the GI Bill, Social Security, and minimum wages that largely left Black people and Black families by the wayside. And I mean, we could get into those details. The bottom line, though, is that according to HR 40 and also HCON Resolution 100 that Congresswoman Barbara Lee is heading up, and that both legislations that Senator Cory Booker has brought up to the Senate and that Vice President Harris was supportive of, and even President Biden has said he is supportive of a commission on reparations. That means he's supportive of HR 40. When we put all this together, and I've been in these spaces quite a bit serving on these committees, there's a lot of credence for restitution and addressing the sort of things that have happened in the past that continue to impact us today. Education is not the great equalizer. In fact, when we compare college-educated whites to college-educated Blacks, college-educated whites have 7 times more wealth than college-educated Black people. And so it's not about how hard you work. It's not about whether or not you have a degree or an advanced degree, but there are real systemic barriers that have existed that we have to be clear that those barriers have existed for Black people, but they have afforded white people certain opportunities to rise that Black people have not. So when it comes to reparations, this is, I think, one of the best ways to address it. And I think, and one of the things I've written, even in Business Insider, is that federal land is the key way. 25% of all land in the United States is federal land. People know when you own land, you can sell it, you can lease it, you can auction it off, you can do all kind of stuff to it. But the point is that the revenue that comes from that is something that can then start to atone for what was promised to Black people, which is that 40 acres and a mule. And the last point is this: all other groups that have been systematically disenfranchised by the federal government have received reparations except for Black Americans. There's a precedent here, and we need for Congress to do the right thing.
So I want to piggyback on that, because I'm so appreciative that you mentioned federal land, because one of the things that we talked about as part of the council is that the federal government should utilize some of this land to create incubators, right? And these incubators, again, should be utilized, or I should say, the preference should be given to Black scholars and folks at HBCUs. And around this notion of reparations, around paying reparations, we recommend what's called an innovation dividend. And I'm sure most people know that the federal government invests in research and development, but they don't always recoup all of the value from that investment. And so one of the things that we recommended is recouping that money, and that value added could be used to fund reparations. And so we get past this, how are we going to pay for it? Because there is a mechanism that's already out there. It's simply, our tax dollars are funding this research, let's go and recoup some of the value. So I'm really happy to hear Rashawn talk about federal land and talk about reparations, because we let people sidetrack us with how it's going to be paid for. And as he said, it's been done in the past. And if you don't want to tax folks, fine, don't tax them. Give us the return on our tax dollars from research and development, and that can fund it.
The Congress just passed the American Rescue Plan. President Biden signed it into law. And in this new law, there are funds for Black landowners, for Black farmers in particular. How do you, both of you, I'd like to know, because unfortunately there was a migration. A lot of us left the farms in the South, went up in the North, Northwest. Now there's a tradition trying to get back to the South, trying to get back to the land. But just like there's voter suppression going on in 28 states, there's also suppression of land ownership, where a lot of land that we used to own has literally been taken away from Black families, similar to what happened in Tulsa, although not violent, but the end results is the same. Black land lost thousands of acres of land is still being lost, even in 2021, as we speak. Can both of you speak about the importance of land ownership?
Let Rashawn talk about that first, since he so eloquently, okay, well, maybe I will talk about it first, right? He so eloquently talked about what are the things that, all the things that you can do with land, from leasing it. And I also think this is a good time to actually talk about a lot of the land. For example, my mother's family has land not very far from where you were talking about, Wilmington, North Carolina, and It has trees on it. And my mother has been approached to buy the timber off the land, right? So it is not always just build on it, lease it, or farm it. Occasionally, there are trees that are on the land that if somebody else comes through and cuts them down and pays you for it, then yay. And I want to say that there's an organization affiliated with maybe NC State, and they do just that. They talk to Black families about how to use that land to plant trees for the lumber, cut them down, and then come back. So you get revenue from them basically harvesting trees on your land without actually taking it away. So I think the importance of land is that sometimes we don't really understand land, right? It is just there, but other folks understand what's the value of land. So it is huge, because there are so many uses for land. And we also want to make sure that if people are going to sell their land, that they're getting fair market value for it. And so what Econ would say to you is it should be the present value of the revenue stream for any dollar that you might get off that land 100 years in advance. right? And sometimes we don't, we just like, I don't want to pay the taxes on it, or this is what the county says the value is on it, and we're done. And we're not thinking about the ways in which that land can produce revenue. So land is huge.
And Dr. Ray, in your research, have you seen that a lot of the land lost because people don't have wills? And if you don't have a will, when the person that owns the land dies, I guess the county takes it over. And then it becomes air property. And a lot of the specifications of how land can be utilized, if it's air property, it can be tied up. So can you speak, Dr. Ray, what you've seen from your research perspective?
Yeah, I mean, well, look, I mean, Rhonda's nailing it. I mean, one of the tragic things that happens when you talk about wills, Dr. Chavis, and when people die is that, or even late life care, is that oftentimes what people don't realize is if someone goes to a facility, whatever resources they have, their financial package,
Yes,
is initially used to pay for that. And so there are a series of things that money and land provides, right? Because now we're getting into what does it mean to leave a legacy? When we start talking about generational wealth. Well, I mean, property is one of the main ways, but then it's also thinking through how we might think about a will and whatever sort of resources they have there, whatever sort of retirement people might be leaving. And Black people are less likely to have that. And if they do, it's more likely to be taken as you're describing. So that is a big way that we see that playing out. And one of the other things we know is that there is a legacy of this with just land, period, which is that Black people have just been less likely to have access to it or have access to land that isn't valued the same. And so part of thinking about that is we know that the Homestead Act, toward the end of the Civil War, right as slavery was ending, the Homestead Act was supposed to provide Black freed people millions of acres of land. Well, that really never precipitated either. And instead, we had over 250 million acres of land that people were able to take advantage of heading west. And that was mostly white people. Like that was the way, say, the Vanderbilts made their money. Some ways that the Roosevelts made their money. If you were like me growing up, you would watch Wild Wild West movies. It'd be like, man, they just really out there just wild. And that was what they were doing. They were heading west to claim land. And as my grandma said, unless the ocean starts receding, God ain't making no more land. So the land is really valuable. And part of it is thinking through that all of these different components, from will constructions, and not just a will, but a living trust, which is really the way that we start protecting it. All of these things cost money. Life insurance cost money. And Black people, even if they have went to college and done those sort of things, oftentimes do not have the expendable income to be able to set themselves up financially to protect what oftentimes little bit of wealth they have been able to build. Because this is the thing, about 50% of all wealth in America is tied up in home ownership. Overwhelmingly, people primarily start building wealth through home ownership. Home ownership is oftentimes used to pay for children to go to college. People take out a home equity line of credit. Well, if you don't have that house, or if your property has been devalued, like we could take Black and white neighborhoods that basically look the same, the crime rates are the same, education is the same, and because those neighborhoods are where Black people live, they have less value. We also know that when houses are appraised, that if it's a neighborhood or even a house owned by a Black person, that these sort of things are devalued. D.L. Hughley is a good example of this. He fixed up his house. I think he purchased it for about $500,000, fixed it up, thought that it was going to sell for probably $700,000-800,000. He got it appraised. It appraised at the same price he purchased it for before he fixed it up. He had a white colleague stand in for him, and then all of a sudden the appraisal went up. We've heard from interracial couples having the same experience.
That's right.
And so when we look at it, no matter how we go about it, everything when Black people does what they're supposed to do, we continuously see these gaps. And this is why we have to have racially equitable policies. And then, importantly, we need to have accountability metrics so that when these things happen, it's not just a slap on the wrist and people keep going. We correct it so that it doesn't keep happening moving forward.
I think Rayshawn gave a really good example when he talked about D.L. Hughley. Like, we talked about data, but we forget the narratives, right? That we need to have the data that show that it is happening, but then we need the human faces who show up and say, no, this is actually my lived experience. And then so much of the other part that he's talking about is under this umbrella of financial literacy. Now, whether or not you are a proponent of financial literacy, is a whole different discussion. I was the director of financial literacy at Bennett College for Women, and I modeled that program very much behind a program at Scripps, which I do believe was something like Wiser Women, right? To make sure that the women at this all women's college were financially savvy. Living trust, participating in retirement, life insurance, understanding home ownership and its value. A lot of this comes under the broader umbrella of financial literacy. Financial literacy goes far beyond budgets of what many people think, but it's all of the tools that can provide us financial freedom. And that's a good deal of what he was just talking about. We do need to have more financial literacy in our community. We do need to have parents having conversation with children about what they own. I'm currently at my parents' house, and there's a driveway that comes down. I didn't even realize on the other side of the driveway was another half acre until I started thinking about building something else. And my mother was like, oh yeah, we've got another. It's like, I would have never known that, right? This fear that we have about talking about the money we have, where it's invested, and I think more importantly, how we're going to protect it. So I really appreciate you talking about not just a living trust, but being mindful about irrevocable trust, right? That can protect us as we age, to make sure that we do have something to leave to our children. I know an older woman, and she said they were upside down in their house in California and her husband died. She said, my husband was okay with that. She's like, I'm not. I'm going to file bankruptcy. I am moving into a senior facility because the money that I have saved is not going to be spent for my care. I'm leaving that to my grandchildren. And and I remember that from the 90s. Right?
Yes.
Because we don't tend to think about that. We think that what we saved has to be able to take care of us, as opposed to thinking about how the system is set up that we can utilize to take care of us. And then we can leave money for our children and our grandchildren.
Well, Dr. Sharp and Dr. Ray, I represent the Black press of America. There are 230 African-American-owned newspapers across the country. I want to make sure that this information that you're giving out as part of the panel gets out consistently. Your point, Dr. Sharp, about the narrative and the data. What is the data? How does that inform the narratives that we should be letting our people know about? And I think some of the cases, some of the issues that you've cited already can be very, very informative. Financial literacy is not something that happens overnight as a process. I'm going to ask both of you now about messaging. But what are from this Wall Street summit, this economic summit that Reverend Jackson has called, it's all virtual, but people are going to be tuning in. People are tuning in to get some sense of what it is they should be doing now in 2021, not only in light of what happened 100 years ago in Tulsa, but what can we learn from the Tulsa event that informs our decision-making today and going forward. Dr. Ray, I'm gonna start with you, and then Dr. Sharp.
Well, I think when it comes to Tulsa, I think it is the promise and the legacy of what Black people can do and what we can collectively do. And I think that that's something that we should never let go. And that is one thing that I've seen over the past few years that has been percolating, even in the social media sphere, even in the mass media sphere, in terms of people recognizing the significance of Tulsa. And again, not just Black Wall Street, but there were others. And we're starting to see some of this. Like, there were a group of families that down in Southern Georgia, they bought a whole bunch of land and they're building homes. They plan to build a school. They literally are aiming to, I think, create another Black Wall Street. And as Rhonda was saying, look, Black people get nervous about that, and rightfully so, about what it means to create your own and the threat that becomes. Like, the threat of Black freedom is ultimately, I think, what Black Wall Street represented. The fact that you aren't dependent economically, you aren't dependent educationally. And you know what? Black people can do that and have always done that. The thing is, though, the legacy of Black Wall Street teaches us that it's not just about surviving, but it's about thriving. And what does that look like to be able to bring resources together? And I think one thing we're seeing, particularly with Black families, but especially with Black women, a huge increase in business ownership. And this is the reason why COVID concerns me so much, not just from a health standpoint, the fact that we know that if Black people and white people had the same COVID rate, that about 20 to 25,000 fewer Black people would be dead right now. The fact that our life expectancy decreased about 3 years from what it was before COVID, but also the economic impact of the pandemic. And what I'm hoping is that people would do is that, yes, it's about going to college. Yes, you should do that. But it's also about thinking about the things that you can't always learn in college, even in an accounting or finance class, which is about financial literacy. It's about thinking through wealth building. It's about making smart decisions. And then most importantly, it is about also realizing that systemic racism is alive and well. And that no matter what you do, there will be things that will block you. And the people on Black Wall Street, in spite of all those things, in the 19 teens and early 20s, were able to overcome that in part. And that's the reason why we have to think comprehensively, not just in terms of thinking about our education and our economics and our wealth, but also then protecting that, not just protecting the property, but protecting the people from people who then come into those spaces and try to not allow Black people to actually actualize the American dream.
Very good. That's Sharp.
So I like one of the things that Rayshawn said, and that is about thriving. I think if you listen closely, it is hard to hear that Black folks are thriving. And while there may be small pockets, there are Black folks who are doing well. And if we are truthful, even in this pandemic, there are Black folks who are doing well. I think the other part that I am most concerned about around the narratives is not just the way others talk about us, but also the ways in which we talk about us and the ways in which we share information. If we look historically, places like Tulsa, and when you and I were talking earlier and you were sharing with me Black folks who moved from Wilmington to Brooklyn, and there was, this little Wilmington and Brooklyn. If we think about the migrations, those migrations happened because Black folks knew Black folks who said, come, I got a job for you and I have a place for you. I'm not so sure our village is being a village as it was in the days of old. And some of that might be a function of integration, just in some ways that we are now a little more disconnected. But the other thing that was mentioned that I think we forget about wealth is, wealth not only allows you to take care of your children, it not only allows you to be protected against economic downturn, but wealth allows you to participate in the political process. When you have money, you have time to go out and volunteer, to be a canvasser. You have money to donate, to make sure that the politicians are the folks who represent your views. So I think it is important that we not just think about wealth in terms of what it means for us monetarily or materialistically, but also what it means in terms of freedom to be able to influence a political process that then influences and protects us, right? And we don't talk about wealth in that way. So I think that's one narrative that I'd like to see us begin to talk about, not just wealth in terms of protecting in terms of downturn, but wealth provides freedom to participate in the political process. When you don't have money, it is hard to be thinking about who you're going to vote for. And that was one of the things that I said, in COVID, right? Like, there's all this conversation about getting folks out to vote. How do you really think about voting when you're trying to figure out how to pay your rent, right? Put food on your table, and you're asking me to vote. And I understand the other side of that is we want a different administration that is going to ensure that we're not in this situation again, right?
Well, one thing for sure, Dr. Sharp, thank God for Black women in Georgia. Thank God for Black women to turn out that vote. in last November and did the unprecedented thing in January. And now we have two new senators and, Stacey Abrams and Natasha Brown and all those sisters that it was almost like her had told me, said, you gonna vote. You're not gonna stay up in here. You're gonna get out and vote. But the thing is, a lot of millennials and Generation Z, they follow Reverend Jackson. They go online and watch this economic summit. What is your message, both Dr. Sharp and Dr. Ray, to millennials and Generation Z? There's an aspiration that a lot of young people want to go into business, become entrepreneurs. Again, using Tulsa as a backdrop to where we are now. Is it your advice that people consider an entrepreneurial path even while they are in school or before they go to school? What's your take on the opportunities? We know about the challenges, but what are the opportunities to go into business for yourself as a Black man, a Black woman, a Black young person?
So I'll take a stab at that first. As one who gave up tenure to and started her own business, yeah. And Rayshawn was like, "What?" That's the response I get from most folks. But there is something about working in the space and being treated bad that I don't necessarily sign up for. But okay. I think the opportunities are great. And I think when we're talking to millennials about starting businesses in Gen Z, who we really should be talking to are their parents and not necessarily them. I would not be able to have done wiser had it not been for my parents and my aunts and my uncles making that investment in me. Not necessarily understanding what I do, but having faith in me. So I think when we're talking about millennials, the opportunity is great, but the real conversation I think is with parents, for parents to understand that this isn't their labor market, right? This isn't the way that business is done. It isn't the way that people are fulfilled anymore by going to work for someone else. For a lot of folks, they have been trained to think, they have been paying attention, they see the gaps in markets, whether that is a for-profit or a non-profit business, right? They understand that. So to me, I don't think the conversation is necessarily with millennials and Gen Z as much as it is with their parents to be supportive, make those investments, let folks come home. Not long term, right? But let them come home to make those investments and be supportive because the opportunities are great. And the businesses don't necessarily look like what we grew up thinking about as a business. When Rayshawn was talking about his virtual lab, so much of what's happening is technology based that many of us don't even have an understanding of, but they do, and they're quite savvy about it. So opportunities are great, and I encourage parents to be supportive.
Very good. Dr. Ray, what have you seen among the students that you intersect with, that you interface with? And what does the landscape look like to you for entrepreneurial development?
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing Rhonda said that was so key is the job market is different today. I mean, in every way, even the way that youth and young adults interact with the public and police is different from the way it was 20, 40 years ago. And I think we have to be understanding of that even though, it's easy to say, oh, I've been your age before. Yeah, but you haven't been this age during this time. And it is uniquely different. And I think that is something to be mindful of. I think when it comes to entrepreneurship, and I've engaged with a series of businesses and currently have a consulting business as well, where I think about what it means to be an entrepreneur. For me, there are a series of non-financial payoffs that are extremely, extremely important. And look, Dr. Sharp is smiling because that's what she talked about walking away from. Look, people got to realize, just let me say this. People got to realize how difficult it is to get a PhD, to get a tenure track job, aim to get tenure and get it, right? And move up the chain, be an associate full professor. That's hard to do. And then thinking about walking away from those things. And part of what we have to realize is that oftentimes some of the same institutions that create us bring us in and spit us back out. And when I think about what it means to be an entrepreneur, these non-financial benefits include having control of your time, not just your money, your time, being able to be autonomous. So having the autonomy to do what you want to do, and more importantly, figuring out what you love to do. You know, one thing that I'm talking about my grandma a lot today, one thing my grandma taught me, she always said, figure out what you love to do and then figure out how to get paid for it. See, that's the key point is oftentimes people look and say, oh, what is the occupation that's hiring people? Well, you got to realize in 5, 10, 20 years, that's not going to be the occupation anymore. And now you've worked that way to do that. Like right now, tech is hot and it's going to be hot for a while. But the thing is what type of tech are you doing? Like artificial intelligence is very different from like having some body worn camera or something, right? So we have to think consciously about that. So what would I specifically say? Figure out what you love to do, figure out how to get paid for it. How do you do that? Identify 5 people who are different ages, who are doing what you love to do, but who might be doing it in different ways. Create an Excel spreadsheet of them and literally mark them off. If you're 20, what were they doing when they were 20? What were they doing when they were 25, when they were 30, when they were 40, when they were 50? What were they doing? Did they go to graduate school? Which graduate schools did they go to? Oh, well, 3 to 5 went to the same graduate school. Well, guess what? That's the place you should probably be getting into, or at least contact them and ask them which places are similar to that. So there are blueprints that do exist that are out here about what it means to be successful. And part of what it means is that being an entrepreneur and owning your own business is difficult. It is hard to do. I mean, look, filling out the taxes alone is difficult, right? But the thing is maybe you want to have a job and you build your business at the same time. So guess what that means? You might be working 60, 80, 100 hours a week. You know what? That's what it's going to take. So part of what we have to do as successful people as well, who are older, is tell younger people the real deal. Like I tell people who want to be academics, who want to be consultants, who want to do all this stuff. I'm like, yeah, you're going to work 80 to 100, 120 hours a week. They're like, what? I'm like, yeah, that's what it's going to take for you to be successful, for you to get to a point where you do control your time, where you control your money, how it comes in and how it goes out. And you have to be willing to pay the price for what it takes to do the things that you're trying to do in life.
I would add one thing to that about being an entrepreneurship, what you're going to do. I think it's also important to listen to the people around you because they often will see the things that you are good at and not to push back against that because you don't see how you're going to make money. When I was an academic, you would ask students what they wanted to do, and they would always say, I don't know. And I would say, bull hockey, you do know. What you haven't figured out is how you're going to make money doing it. Right. But that doesn't mean that you don't know. And then the other part that I would say, you know, that with my mom, again, we're talking about grandma and moms today, right? And that is, parents need to recognize, or let me say this differently. What I said to some students at Bennett College who were part of their Summer Entrepreneur Institute is co-signing is for loans. It's not for dreams. And that is real important when you are thinking about the business that you want to do. Do your homework, as Rayshawn has said, but nobody needs to give you permission to do that. If you're willing to put in the work, if you're willing to make the sacrifices, then do that. I've had people ask me, aren't I concerned about Black men? Why are we the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race? And one of my someone on my advisory board who was a male was like, you should have told the person if they were interested or concerned about Black men, they could go start their own nonprofit. And I thought, I'm not the person to tell that, right? Because I will happily tell someone, right? Like, this is what I chose to do. It doesn't have to be what you do. And I think that's important for us to remember. Everybody has their own life and they're going to have their own path. Don't block and don't be a dream killer. If you can't be supportive, then be quiet.
I like that. You know, both of you are distinguished scholars in your own fields, but you're also you're teachers. You're teaching. And to me, one of the greatest professions in the world is a teacher. And where the teacher teaches the student and the student then becomes a teacher and teaches another student, on and on and on. So I'm going to end our panel where we started. And I would like for you to tell our audience succinctly what history teaches us about Tulsa. First you, Dr. Sharp, and then Dr. Ray, and this hour has gone by so quickly.
I think that what history has taught us about Tulsa is to use a term that we really hear is to stay woke, because we are an incredibly vulnerable population as Black folks, even when we have money. And that's what I think we saw in Tulsa, that money does not protect you from the state, right? And even if when we band together, we may not be protected from the state. So I think that's one. And then I would just ask folks, we need the data to make the cases for reparations. We need data to prove discrimination. So when folks are asking you to fill out forms, by all means, be hesitant, reach out to your local colleges, build a relationship with someone that you can ask, is this legit? But we need you to fill out those forms, because without that data, we can't craft effective policies and we can't hold folks accountable.
Very good. Dr. Ray, what does history teach us about Tulsa?
What Dr. Sharp said. I think one of the things about it is, I'll go back to the thriving part. I mean, look, I've lived in every region of the country. I've even lived and taught overseas in Europe. And there is something unique about seeing thriving Black communities. And it's unfortunate that a majority of people, Black, white, or otherwise, have not seen that. But those of us who have, whether that be in Prince George's or in Atlanta or in southern parts of Southern California, and other parts of the country, whether that be in South Africa, other parts on the continent, we know what that looks like. And oftentimes people cannot be what they cannot see. So what I urge us to do is to continue to highlight the legacy of Tulsa, show pictures, show images, share documents. What did it look like for Black people to own an entire town like that, for it to be thriving? What were the names of the businesses? Who were the people? And the same way that I'm talking about finding models, find models in Tulsa. I think that's the legacy, is they are the blueprint. And I think we can follow that and continue to replicate that even in today's society.
Dr. Rashawn Ray, Professor of Sociology and Executive Director of the Lab for Applied Social Science and Research at the University of Maryland, College Park, and the Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Rhonda Von Shea Sharp, President and founder of the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, and past president of the National Economic Association. Thank you very much. It's been a great panel. And I thank again Reverend Jesse Jackson for inviting us to participate in the 2021 Wall Street Project Economic Summit.
It's been great.
The day the world stopped was the day we found where to go. From now on, we're not going to leave anything on our plates, because we've learned to savor the moments that were always there, and they never tasted this good.
Each year, we pay homage to a few of the leaders in the industry. Last year, we were unable to do so. So we take the time now to celebrate the following. Reverend Johnny M. Green Jr., Senior Pastor, the Mount Nebo Baptist Church in Harlem, New York. I. Javette Hines, Director, Head of Supply Chain Development, Inclusion, and Sustainability at Citi. Emmett T. Vaughn, former Director of Diverse Supplier Inclusion Strategies, Exelon Corporation, posthumously. Congratulations. It's time for our second session of the day, titled The Current Realities, Restoration, Stability, and Growth of Black Wealth After COVID-19. Let's welcome the session's moderator, Derek Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton is the Henry Cohen Professor of Urban Policy at the New School. Dr. Hamilton.
It's an honor to be here at the 24th Annual Wall Street Project Conference hosted by Rainbow Push Coalition. Our panel today is The current realities, restoration, stability, and the growth of the Black wealth gap after COVID-19. Actually, I kind of misspoke. And growth of Black wealth after COVID-19. I'm Derek Hamilton. I'm a university professor and the Henry Cohen Professor of Urban Policy and Economics at the New School and the founding director of the Institute for Race and Political Economy. This Wall Street Project Conference comes at an important moment. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, which was a lethal assault on the Black community, Black bodies, and Black wealth. A great deal of scholarship has already made clear that the white asset-based middle class never simply just emerged. Rather, it was government policy, and to a large extent, entitlements, literally government giveaways that provided whites with the finance, education, land, and infrastructure to accumulate and pass down wealth from one generation to the next. This is in contrast to a history in which Blacks and Indigenous people, their personhood and whatever capital and resources they may have established has always been vulnerable to exploitation and extrapolation, and here's a key word, by state complicit confiscation, destruction, terror, fraud, theft, and other acts of violence. Tulsa, which was once considered Black Wall Street, provides a vivid but not isolated example of what we're talking about. As a result, Blacks as a group have very little ownership in America's land or means of production, and also remain in fear of violence, incarceration, and loss of resources in life, even today. And of course, this conference comes as the United States and the entire world are still struggling with the COVID-19 pandemic, a pandemic that brought about a swift recession, whose harms are disproportionately delivered to Black and brown communities. We should note that the biggest pre-existing condition of them all is the wealth gap itself, the racial wealth gap or one's wealth position. Wealth impacts people's ability to respond to a pandemic. It provides security during an economic emergency. And this crisis will only exacerbate that unjust racial wealth gap that leaves communities with low assets and vulnerable unless we do something about it. So today we're going to talk about what is necessary to stabilize, restore, and grow Black wealth. What can be done to close the racial wealth gap? I'm joined by three remarkable leaders, and I'm excited about the conversation the four of us are going to have today. Joining me on the panel are Eugene Mitchell, Kwaku Abed, and Andre Perry. I got to get on Andrew Cuomo out my head. Andre Perry. Eugene Mitchell is the president and CEO of E. Mitchell Enterprises, a financial consultant and service firm. Prior to starting his own country, Eugene spent nearly 2 decades as corporate vice president and African-American market manager at New York Life Insurance Company, leading over 1,500 financial professionals nationwide. Eugene has been featured in the New York Times, Black Enterprise, BlackPressUSA.com, and appeared on ABC, NPR News. And in 2019, his first book came out, Closing the Racial Wealth Gap, 7 Untold Rules for Black Prosperity and Legacy. Then we have Andre Perry, who is a senior fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings, a scholar in resident at American University, and a columnist for the Hetchinger Report. He is the author of a new book, which I encourage y'all all to go out and buy, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black City. It's currently available wherever books are sold. A nationally known and respected commentator on race, structural inequality, and education, Perry is a regular contributor to MSNBC and has been published by the New York Times, The Nation, The Washington Post, The Root, and CNN.com. Kwaku Abed. Did I pronounce your name right, brother?
It's Obed, but that's
Obed.
close. That's close. It's in the vicinity.
Thank you. He is the managing director of Marquette Associate, one of the largest investment consulting firms in the United States. He is a certified financial analyst, charter holder, and a chartered alternative investment analyst. Before coming to Marquette, Kwaku served in firms including Mercer Investment Consulting, Merrill Lynch Investment Managers. Recently, Kwaku authored a new children's book titled Talking About the ABCs of Financial Literacy, a book that covers financial and investment terms in a playful way meant to provide an introduction to the world of finance for all ages and improve accessibility of people from all backgrounds. So let's get into the conversation. The first question I have for my panelists is, how does your personal life experience inform your perspective on the racial wealth gap? Can you give a personal narrative that in some way links historically to why there is such large racial disparity when it comes to wealth and today?
You know,
So anyone jump in.
yeah,
I think Andre,
I'll start. You know, when I started researching for my book, Know Your Price, what I did was follow where my father once lived. To make a long story short, I was informally adopted by an older woman in the hood. And one of the reasons why my father was in and out of prison because of a heroin addiction. And so for writing my book, I looked at where he lived to have a better understand of the conditions in which he lived and died. He was eventually murdered in prison outside of Detroit. And what I found is he lived in neighborhoods that were once redlined, where the Homeowners Loan Corporation drew red lines around Black majority neighborhoods to deem those neighborhoods too hazardous or unworthy of investment in the form of low interest loans and down payment assistance. He lived in areas where highway construction barreled through Black neighborhoods. You saw that a lot during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He was also victimized by urban renewal, I think, which was informally called Negro replacement in the 60s and 70s. He also lived in areas where there was significant predatory lending, where particularly these rent-to-own schemes. And he also lived around areas that had racially restrictive housing covenants where he could not move into because of the color of his skin. So then I started looking at the home prices today in those neighborhoods. And what I did was compare the homes in Black neighborhoods where the share of the Black population is greater than 50%, and compared those to places where the share of the Black population is less than percent. And we controlled for education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics. And what we found, again, this is an apples to apples comparison between homes in Black neighborhoods and homes in white neighborhoods. We found that homes in Black neighborhoods on average were underpriced by 23%, about $48,000 per home. Cumulatively, there was a loss about $156 billion across the country in lost equity. Now, I bring that up because there is no question, if my father lived in areas where there was not housing discrimination, he would have had better opportunities to start a business. Remember that most people start their businesses using the equity in their homes. And in fact, that $156 billion equates to about 4 million Black-owned businesses based on the average amount Blacks use to start up their firms. He would have had a better opportunity to go to college. In fact, that $156 billion is the equivalent of 8 million four-year degrees based on the average amount of a public four-year education. And it's double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. If he lived in a white neighborhood, there was no question he would have better schools, better opportunity to start a business, better opportunity to go to college. His life would have been different. No question, I never excuse his behavior. But when you talk about his behavior, you have to include the discrimination that impacted his life and my life. People will say, hey, I'm doing well off. I work at Brookings. The reality is that I had to take more student loans because my family did not accumulate wealth. I had to go through a lot of different things I probably shouldn't have, simply because of the wealth that was extracted from my family. So I'm very cognizant of how wealth is developed through policy for some, and how it is denied to others, and it's still with us today.
I mean, we're going to get others in the panel, but let me just say, and I think you'll be okay with me saying this, your story is not remarkable for Black people, that others may have similar narratives, but it's certainly remarkable of where you are and what you've accomplished in your life, and being able to overcome various obstacles. So, I just want to applaud you for all that you do and having the wherewithal and the sensibility to extrapolate your own personal experience to that of others. So,
yeah, thank you. And you're right, I'm not unique by a long shot, but discrimination has robbed so many people like me. Because, as you know, people will say, well, what made you different? I was like, well, I actually got this from my father. He was denied the ability to climb, and countless other are.
Eugene, Kwaku?
Sure, I'll jump in. It's interesting, similar to Andre, actually mine was a personal experience. My first major job was being a corrections officer, a prison guard down in Miami for 4 years. And similarly, I think what became abundantly clear very quickly, the majority Black and brown population there were there for reasons a lot deeper rooted than what we typically say. We typically look at the crime, the drugs, the non-nuclear households as the problems in our community. But what I realized is that for most of them there, economics was the real root cause of the problem. Because, it started to dawn on me, if they had been set up with a college savings plan at some point in their history, would their life have been different, right? Had they had a down payment for a home, a startup capital for their own business, would their path have been different, right? Likewise, if they had guidance and advice and love and support and sort of true, nurturing to develop and be on a better path. I could clearly see that was different for them than it was for me. So mine was an immigrant family. My father came from Grenada. I was born in England. We came to the States when I was 12. In a 2-income home, lower middle class, I got to see, them put time and effort and the emphasis on sort of working government jobs and to get a pension, to get a regular paycheck, to work overtime, right? They took on their savings and their tax return to buy a dilapidated home that we moved into. That we were wondering, why are we here? But it was an opportunity for them to come home and have a night job fixing a wall and reading on how to fix a sink and the likes. And that was the way that they started to build for themselves. And that was the message they taught me and my sister on how we could, sort of be on a better path and sort of, and what they sacrificed for is that we could go to school and have some other options, have other skills that they didn't have. I think that the next part for me, the personal experience side, was when it dawned on me that I wanted to do something bigger and better to help the dynamic of the inmates in prison. I could see I couldn't do it as a prison guard. I decided to go back to school because the state, working for the state, they paid for 2 classes a semester. So I paid for 2 classes a semester. So I took on finishing a finance degree at Florida International University. Then I got accepted to do my MBA at NYU Stern School of Business and moved up to here. And then from there, I got placed into a position at New York Life Insurance Company during one of the last recessions back in 2001. Unbeknownst, unknowing that where my path was going to go, but falling into financial services opened my eyes to a whole new world of realizing how other races, religions, and ethnic groups set up their children and their families very differently than we do, using tools like life insurance. in ways that we have not been doing to the same extent that they've been doing, right? And so to your point, I realize it's part of the lack of information, the lack of awareness, the lack of knowing how others are using some of these tools to benefit themselves was part of this challenge, especially in an industry now, a life insurance industry that's been around, the company has been around 175 years, right? That they've got a history of insuring slaves, right? Of race-based underwriting, of not allowing Blacks to purchase the same amount as others. It's only the 60 years ago the first Black agent was hired into a major Black insurance, a major white insurance company. So you talk about the lack of training, the lack of access. You talk about the lack of development, facing the good old boy network, the nepotism, right? The racism within the industry. That's still today, so few Blacks make it to the successful ranks of in corporate and on the agent side or the field side in sales and management. You know, I think this is all coming back from stemming back to the racist past, the practices, the procedures, the ways that we've been kept out for so long, not only in the way of the employment and moving up, but also the access and utilization of these tools to create generational wealth. So I think that's one of the major things that I've taken on.
Yeah, no, that's great. And, you know, the example of Tulsa is even beyond people. We had institutions. When we've had Black institutions, they've been vulnerable to straight up theft, terror, confiscation. And, you know, that's been a big problem in our history, including the insurance industry. You know, we've had Black insurance firms. We should note that. Kwaku, let's see.
Yeah, so from my standpoint, first of all, thank you both for sharing, you know, your personal journeys, snippets of your personal journeys, and you know, how do you follow, you know, two great introductions. But I'll say this from a personal standpoint, my parents, they instilled in me the stubbornness to never give up, the stubbornness to never say no, and really, from my standpoint. You know, my story is a little bit different. So I was born in the US, but left the US. Well, my parents left the US for Europe. And it was a question of the opportunity, the environment around us, and really the stubbornness to not be, you know, controlled by your environment or the lack of opportunity in the environment. Again, there's been a stubbornness, I think, in my family to view education as a key essential ingredient to moving forward. So my parents, they were born at a time where for both of them to be educated and for both of them to have, you know, college education was pretty remarkable. My father born in the late 30s, my mother born in the 40s. My family's originally from Ghana. It was known as the Gold Coast at the time. So really from the 60s onwards, my family story has been one of traveling and one of making sure that, you know, there's a stubbornness to not accept whatever someone's limitation is for what you should be or what you can be. So that really took us to Europe for a period of time. And really the central theme, I think, in my family has really been around education, watching my parents really sacrifice to make sure that their children got the educations that they deserved, and also instilling in their children that they were worth investing in was something that I am still very, you know, humbled and feel blessed to have had as an experience. So ultimately, you know, as sad as it is, I think that's a unique experience, right? Having parents that didn't put themselves first and really put their children first, again, instilling education in us as the key ingredient to getting us to a certain level, but then the stubbornness to know that once you get to that level, you're going to reach obstacles. So again, that's really, you know, my story, and it kind of resonates with some of the points made earlier.
Yeah, no, thank you, Kwaku. And I guess I'll offer a tidbit also in saying that adage of work twice as hard to get by, a statement I made in the past, the part we don't ask is at what cost? And for me, that question resonates with my personal narrative because I lost my parents early. They put me in elite schools. I think I grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, and had the privilege to see that fundamentally people are not that different. To me, the critical ingredient was resources. I had to, I went to an elite school, and on the one hand could see what resources can afford, and on the other hand, I could see what lack of resources presents as well. But it wasn't my choice for them to sacrifice the extent that they did so that I had those opportunities. Obviously, unfortunate, but I want to live in a society where people don't have to make those tragic choices. I want to live in a society where one doesn't have to put up with stress, etc., so that their children can do better than they did. That is what the ideals of a humanist society might be. And I guess it prompts me to another question that I'm going to put to the group, and not even a question, just vibe on this for a little while. Each of us have talked about behaviors to some extent, as well as resources. No question, behaviors can influence an outcome. No question, resources can influence the outcome. But can we tease out direction a little bit? Can we think about, what's the chicken and egg problem? Is there any elaboration on that? And I want to tee it up by one, acknowledging that we are a mammal, and that we need some women on this panel. But I want to give a shout out to a woman, Diane Stewart, who wrote a book called Black Women, Black Love. And in the book, the thesis is basically looking at family outcomes, not as the input, but the outcome, and resources as the input. Her argument is that the systems of oppression, racism, have not facilitated the pathways for love that's humanistic for Black women, that having under-resourced families, men or women, is inhumane. So, I just want to see if we can vibe a little on that, see what people have to contribute about this causal relationship.
So I'm going to jump in really quickly and just say that this is probably a theme that's going to resonate throughout the conversation. And I think the theme is, you're in a race. Let's say it's the 400-meter race, and someone else has 100, 200, 300-meter head start ahead of you. And that's the dynamic. So whether it's relationships intimate, whether it's relationships economic, I really think that's going to be the key dynamic that's going to determine the imbalance that we're talking about. So I just wanted to mention that as a common theme that really resonates. And that imbalance, again, if a race has been started and you're not really part of the race, the family dynamic didn't really matter up until a few decades ago in this country, right? So the nurturing of the Black family, the Black family unit, that was the antithesis of the existence of Black people in this country for a long period of time. So again, think about the dynamic of the race and not being part of the race till much later on. And I think that sums up where we are.
In my mind, I know we dwell a lot on sort of the struggles and the challenges and what we don't have and how far behind it's going to, the mark is and how many years it's going to take for us to catch up. I think there's an opportunity to I know the great organization Be Me and Travian Shorters talks about asset framing. Okay, can we spin into, because we talk about how many Black men are in jail. We talk about sort of the dropout rate. It's always the negative. But when you think about the positives, that can we don't know how many Black millionaires. Most of us can't rattle that off, right? How many Black men are in the military? What are the success stories? And so for me, that's about sort of adapting this mindset. I think for so long, and I think it's part of this inferiority, ingraining philosophy that the country has. We are always trying to figure out, how far, behind we are and what we need to do to catch up. I think that there are great success stories. There are Black men taking care of their families. There are wonderful Black families, and we've had them. From civil rights, going back through slavery, we still got married. We still had a family unit. We were still building and sacrificing, as Quaker said, for our children and the next generation. For the industry I came from, Big Mama had a life insurance policy, that she wanted to not be a burden to the family when something happened to her, that they would pay for this great homegoing. I believe that didn't teach her the ways that she could have left some generational wealth and set the children up. But we have positives that we can, I think add on to and celebrate and pull out in my mind, and not only and take that as the way to frame the positives for the family unit and what we can do to build mindset. And then we can steer the spending habits and sort of the messaging for the children, especially, to combat that, the social media that they're seeing every day, the athletes and the entertainers, the reality TV that talks about sort of spending and this, how you show your value when your worth is through these, the products and services. And so it's never about yourself. It's about sort of depreciating assets versus what we can do to continue to build and add to what we do have and celebrate from there.
And I should say this, that the race has begun, and perhaps, some folks weren't invited to the race early on, but we're still running. So that's the other point. That's the other part of the equation. It's not necessarily all doom and gloom. It's not necessarily all this homogenous experience, right? There is a lot of strength. There's a lot of beauty. There's a lot of power in how the story is being told. But you can't really ignore the realities of what it means to run quicker, what it means to be better, what it means to be faster. So it's this weird dichotomy that we're in, right? It's, was it Talib Kweli, Life is a Beautiful Struggle? I think that accurately captures this present day situation. There's beauty to it, but there's struggle to it. And that's where we are.
It wasn't until I got to college did I realize white people thought the way I was raised, the woman who raised me, was putting me in harm's way. And I read the Moynihan Report as a freshman. And up until that point, I understood that the woman who took me in did so to save my life. She responded to the neighborhood conditions like lots of Black women did during that time. They filled a breach that private industry and government did not fill when there was an economic crisis. She instilled in me work ethic, pride. In fact, for most of my history, it wasn't until recently I even talk about my dad or my family, because she would say, don't talk about it, nobody's going to listen to you, type of thing. She was definitely one of those, just keep moving type of people. But, when I got to college and I read that, I was like, wow, clearly Patrick Moynihan did not have a Black woman in his vicinity when he wrote this, because he would know that Black women, Black families are responding to the overall socioeconomic conditions around them. It makes no sense to say that Black families are causing our own plight. It just doesn't make sense. So for me, I do see a causal relationship. I see how discrimination, a lack of wealth, leads to behaviors that sometimes are adaptive in nature. But if there was not that discrimination, we probably would see different types of outcomes, different types of family construction. And Derek, you've heard me say this all the time, and I really do mean this. There's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. Right. That our families, our behaviors are seen as pathological, and we ignore the causal factors that led to any kind of outcomes that we see undesirable. And so for me, it's about recognizing certainly that racism, wealth extraction, practices in various industries. I mean, Eugene, you can appreciate this. The woman who raised me did not like. The only time I would see her get angry was when the insurance man would come, because she knew that she was getting robbed. It was predatory in nature.
That's right.
And so now, as who I have the option of having life insurance, I have health insurance, all these things. It took some trust building in that process. And so for me, I say, hey, look, we got to continuously remove these drags of racism in our systems, because they're truly the reason why we have so many negative outcomes. And we have to stop blaming oftentimes Black women for putting children in harm's way. I mean, it goes with the Reagan era and the welfare queen. And I mean, that's still with us in terms of our thinking. We think that women really are not doing it, but it's just not true. And one more thing, I just want to say that so many of our families, single family headed households and the like, they are of upstanding character. Like you, when I see the people who go to work every day, manage their money, a lot of them from low income places, they just don't have the resources, the assets to truly grow. And so I'll leave it there, because I'm more like, we got to get this racism thing down. Because if you don't address that, it almost forces you to blame people, the victims, instead of some of these other causes.
And you know, I will even push back on the notion of pathology in the Black community. Black communities empirically are no more pathological than white communities. We have pathology, period, that's problematic that we need to deal with. But we also have lack of resources, period, Black or white, that we also need to deal with. But that causal relationship of what causes what, I do believe and know that resources have a lot to do with choices and authentic choices if we really want to see what behavior means. And let me document this a little bit. I've seen literature on reports of violence in childhood, and contrary to popular belief, there are no more reports of violence that Black children report than white children. If we talk about 3 forms of violence: sexual assault, community violence, or household violence. And violence in any group especially for children, is intolerable. But nonetheless, when we talk across races explanations, we sometimes just fall into a narrative that that's the explanation, but it doesn't bear out empirically. Another thing I'll point out is you all have lifted up Black excellence, and we should lift that up. We should talk about all the ways, not even in this moment, throughout history, where we have had not just individuals, groups actually rise up despite conditions they face. And we got many examples of that, right? Again, this conference is being in the backdrop of the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, considered a society that had been built up in Tulsa prior to that massacre. Black excellence. And not only is there economic resources that's needed, it's a political codification that when we acquire those resources, it's not subject to that type of terror. It's, again, state sanctioned. Couple other points I want to make, and that is some sobering statistics. Even when Black people acquire the skills that we deem useful in market settings, they still do not have equity in a relative sense. As a matter of fact, if we look at racial wealth disparity with education, the gap doesn't subside, it actually grows. We have scenarios where the Black families where the head graduated from college typically have less wealth than white families where the head dropped out of high school. We've been talking a lot about health in this panel. We know scenarios where a Black woman who's expecting a child with a college degree is more likely to have an infant death than a white woman who dropped out of high school. And it's not unique to women. A Black man with a college degree is 3 times more likely to die from a stroke than a white man who dropped out of college. These are inconvenient truths that we have to deal with. And the last thing I'll say is, even when we look at an outcome that we deem as pathological, take payday lending. Everybody on this panel knows that they're debt traps, that payday loans, you end up getting in these scenarios where You have exorbitant interest rates, and you're never paying down principal. You're basically fighting in order to try to cover the interest rate until ultimately you default. That is never a first option for people. People turn to payday lending because they have no other alternative when they exhaust family and friends. So it's not an authentic choice. We need to, if you know, in the end, I'll put a button and shut up in a second. But in the end, if we really want to see behavior, make sure that people are properly resourced, then make an assessment on behavior. That's my 2 cents on it. But let me ask a question about healing.
Let me add in, Derek, I'm just, you got me going here, because I think that's part of it. I think, as Andre is alluding to, it's the system too, though. So a major part of what we're fighting is the system. When you think about the disparities that Blacks faced last year with the health crisis due to COVID-19, right? The economic downturn, right? The social justice crisis. It's a system that kept the folks from the Black neighborhoods, the brown neighborhoods, from the testing sites, so we're getting access and the proper treatment, right? When you think about the lack of access to the PPP, this Paycheck Protection Program, right? I don't see anybody going back to figure out where were the hiccups or the hamstrings in us getting access to that, right? When you think about the social justice crisis, it's the system that we're calling out, and I think that's the underlying part of this. When you think about the wealth gap, the historical contributions, the historical machine, the mechanism for 400 years that has gotten us here, that's the major part of what we're needing to fix. And that coupled with personal action, there are things that we can do for ourselves to address the current contributing factors to the wealth gap, but it's those historical factors that still exist today. These industries that we, like you said, equity, there is no equity, let alone equality for us in these systems that we need to rectify.
Yeah. And, I'm going to say I'm proud and excited to be on this with all of you, because it's clear y'all bring passion to this work, and it's okay to bring passion to this, right? That's why we began with the personal narrative, because this is not just about us, and it's important, and it should be passionate. So anybody else want to chime in before I move to the next question?
I will say, just to add on to this, because I don't want the PPP loan fiasco when to go by when the CARES Act was initially announced and released. Everybody knew, everybody who had any kind of familiarity with banking in this country knew that Black people were not going to see their fair share in that. I mean, largely because most Black businesses, in fact, 95% of Black businesses are sole proprietorship. So they were structurally excluded from that subsidy. Now, they were hurting just as other businesses. But the reason why we have so much higher percentage of sole proprietorships is directly related to discrimination in housing and in banking and lending practices, directly related. And so when they announced that program, we didn't need to see white only signs to know that this was a structurally exclusive package during a pandemic, which, I mean, by the time the policy caught up to the reality, those businesses had to close because they could not lean on savings. They could not lean on home equity. They had to max out credit cards, use all kind of uncollateralized debt to serve, just to live. And so that was a government sponsored program that helped widen the wealth gap in this country. And so I just want to put that out there, because this isn't just, we've been talking about history. That was last year. and it occurs almost after every kind of shock to the economy. I mean, I've been dealing with, in the last 20 years, Hurricane Katrina, housing bubble, all kind of crises. These keep coming up, and every time we say, "Oh, we got to get this right on the policy side," and it's like, no, we got to get this right, or we're always going to take a few steps back when these epidemics occur.
So I'm gonna ask a question about healing. I'm gonna ask, what does healing mean? Is it necessary? Can we, do we have to go through a period of healing? What does it mean? Actually, I'm just gonna leave it at that. Tell me what healing means to you in the concept of political economy and race. Is it a necessary ingredient? And that's it. That's the question.
So I think the healing is happening right now. I think for something to heal, in some instances, it needs to get acknowledged. And I think we're going through an acknowledgement today. The big thing is whether the wound will be allowed to heal or whether the wound will be opened up again, right? That's ultimately, I think, the issue that we're facing. But I think healing is essential to dealing with many of the things that we've discussed, because again, in healing, it means that there's a renewment, there's an essential way to, I don't want to say move forward, but there's a way to evolve beyond the pain that was there. So I think we're at a critical point. We are at crossroads today. And I wish I had a crystal ball. I wish I could say that this is it, this is the time. And we can't really delude ourselves. I think in all of our families, whether it's our parents, our grandparents, their parents before them, I think they've all been at a point where history has looked very promising. And it's a time to be optimistic. And I think this is the time for us today. Unfortunately, we just don't know what's going to happen. So I think the healing has begun, the healing is beginning, but I don't know if that healing will get interrupted or not. I wish I had a crystal ball. I do think it's essential to look at political economy. It is essential to look at things of the past to move ahead. They always say, those that don't know history are doomed to repeat it, right? The failures of history. So ultimately, I'll stop there because I could talk for hours about this. But no, essentially, I mean, I'll put it this way: I'm a lot more optimistic than I am pessimistic today. I feel that there's an awareness and awakening, and particularly for the younger generation, you have to give them some credit that they're not in that position where they want to back down. I don't think no is going to be taken for an answer. So the optimism that I have is hopefully grounded in reality. And the other realization I think that's happening is this awareness that when you're part of a family, right? So regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, anyone in the US is part of the US, right? You're part of the US family. So if a member of your family is hurting, but you're ignoring that family member being hurt, your family unit is not whole, right? So I think the US is also realizing that part of its people, be they Black and brown people, they're hurting right now. And there's an acknowledgement that to be our best self, our best country, you have to make sure that everyone in the family is doing okay. So again, my optimism is there, and I'm hoping 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we're on a panel where we're happy about the progress that's been made, the realization that frank discussions around redlining, frank discussions around segregation, frank discussions around disparities around access to education, these are things of the past and they're now being addressed. So that is my hope. And again, that's being grounded in the fact that there is this energy and there's this excitement. And again, you have millions of people that aren't backing down. They can't go back to how things were. So what can you do from that point? You can only really move forward. So I hope that the healing process is allowed to finish. I hope it's a natural one. It may be a painful one, but ultimately I think it's what's best for the country and the people in this country, regardless of your race, ethnicity, gender. A Black America that's doing well is an America that's doing well. A brown America that's doing well is an America that's doing well. And it doesn't have to be this mutually exclusive option where one side of America is doing well to the detriment of another. So I think the more we realize this, which again, I believe that we are beginning to see this, I think the truer we are to that dream happening.
If we were in person and it wasn't a pandemic, I'd reach out and give a fist bump. Anybody else?
If I can add on to it, let me jump in, Andre, just so I know you can bring it home. Adding to the healing for me, though, and the acknowledgement is also some way that we need to reconcile, remediate, and pay reparations for the past, right? It's this, we've got to acknowledge how far back that, we've left the Black community. Whether we look towards these, like I said, these law changes, the affordable housing, the business tax breaks, educational spending, baby bonds, we've got to find a way to make people whole, to bring them up and put them on par. We can acknowledge, the way it's been. We can, talk about systemic change, but I think there has to be some investment and some sort of sacrifice made now to build up the Black community. It's like I said, we're not, going to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps by ourselves at this point. There's got to be some acknowledgement for these 400 years of getting us here. That's going to help us move forward as a whole unit.
I'll answer your question in two ways. I think that there's economic healing and social healing.
Yeah.
On the economic front, it speaks to what Eugene was speaking of, that it's not enough to uplift equity, as President Biden is doing. And we should applaud that, to lift up the value of equity. There's another side of that. It's about money. It's about repairing and restoring the value that's been extracted by racism in various markets. So healing for me economically looks like how down payment assistance for low income home buyers. It looks like low interest mortgages and new loan products for people trying to buy homes. It looks like a different type of social safety net. It's the development of baby bonds, something that's near and dear to your heart, Derek, that we need new ways for people to develop wealth in this country. And we also need just a new safety net so that when these epidemics happen, we're not asking, why did this happen again? And so we need to, as Eugene stated, we need that kind of economic healing, but it must be alongside some type of social healing. Some of that social healing will come in policy, because remember, things like public schools are still a major driver of sort of socialization and civics and all of that. So healing looks like better history curricula. It looks like better civics education, ultimately. But I also have found just a newfound respect and love for the Black church in recent years. And that's largely come from Reverend Barber of the Poor People's Campaign, because he's truly pastoring the nation right now on what it means to be poor and what's our obligation to the stranger, to the person in need. And that type of healing is absolutely needed. And in particular, I will say this, Trump revealed so many things, but the white evangelicals that were willing to sort of put aside all these sort of serious ethical, moral, immoral actions, unethical actions, there needs to be healing there. And I think Reverend Barber and others of that ilk who are willing to use the doctrine of whatever religion they're in to show these are the values you're supposed to live up to, and do it in a way that brings them along. And so for me, I'll leave it there, but there needs to be that economic healing. And I'm more interested in that, because social healing becomes a lot easier when you're not being evicted. And so but for me, but you still need that social healing aspect.
And that healing also is there. I think one indicator that it's there is when folks can look at those that are in a poorer situation and understand how they got there, as opposed to blaming them for being in that situation. And I think that's truly that sign that the healing process is underway.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think that's right. A shift in understanding of poverty being grounded in resources as opposed to deficit behavior comes about from healing that truth and reconciliation. And I'm also hearing loud and clear that it's a little empty if not accompanied by some actual resource. So
Right.
you know, I appreciate that. So we're a little bit winding down. We got about 10 minutes left.
That's it.
Conversation goes fast.
I've got time. If you guys have time, I can keep going.
I guess we can't take all the space in the conference, but I'm going to ask a question that takes away the scarcity constraint. I'm going to ask two final questions to everybody, and I'm going to give you the last question before the first one. The last question I'm going to ask, just so you have a little time to think about, reimagine the society that you want without constraints. Forget about political constraints. Imagine if you could define a society in some way. What would it look like? Where do we want to go? Give me some definition. And, you know, maybe if you want, you can add on to the answer, how could we get there? But ignore the how we can get there when you give your answer. And then that's the final question. But before that, I want to ask, what are you optimistic about? And I'll lead with my answer. Andre referenced the Biden administration. In this Rescue and Recovery Act that was just passed, it's my understanding that $5 billion is designated towards loan cancellation for Black farmers. And we've been talking a lot about the role of history in government complicit action. Now, that makes me optimistic. We know that the Trump interventions, when it came to the trade war with China, less than 3% of those resources went to Black farmers. We know historically, if we think about all the land that had amassed to Black people, despite all the racism that we described in history, and that got lost over the years by, you know, defrauding them on government policy, not allowing them to have access to it, direct action from USDA, that estimate of that land loss is at a minimum 300 billion and more likely around 1.3 trillion or more. So think about the context of that. I'd say that $5 billion where government is acknowledging the harms that have been committed and trying to do something about it, albeit a drop in the bucket, I'm optimistic. So what y'all got?
You know, I believe we can live in a society where anyone can go to college and not have to pay a loan or tuition. And it's clear that a college education is as basic as a K-12 education. And no one is asked to pay back a grant at the K-12 level. And we should have the same sort of system at the higher ed level. And I actually think and this is another reason why I'm optimistic, I actually think we're moving in that direction. I mean, already there are a number of states and cities with free community college or government subsidized community college. But I actually think we can push this issue and it will get widespread support. But I agree with Derek in this regard. I think the rescue bill plan it really represented a change in philosophy we have not seen really since the New Deal. That we're going to, one, put money in the pockets of regular people, regular essential workers, low-income folks, instead of this belief that or too big to fail type of perspective. Now we see that families are too big to fail. So I'm going to close with, I do see a society in which people are going to college at higher rates. There's less loan debt. We're removing the drags of racism in various aspects, but most importantly, I think government will get back to the business of serving people and not corporations. And so I'm encouraged by a lot of that activity.
I'll jump in, and I appreciate everything you said, Andre and Derek. I'm optimistic about the systemic and the policy changes that are coming. The other thing for me in the space that I live in is in this personal action side and what we're doing within our community to create change. I created and led a program that has created millionaire Black families. Almost $1 billion has been paid out. This was leveraging financial tools and strategies, like I said, that we haven't traditionally been exposed to. Back in 2011, I created a $50 billion community empowerment plan. The idea was to get 200,000 Black people to see the value of owning at least $250,000 of life insurance. You can insure your parents, insure yourself, insure your children, making sure that we have now generational wealth being created. 200,000 people with $250,000 of life insurance will create $50 billion of protection and tax-free future income. And so this is something that we can do for ourselves. When you talk about financial stability, when you think about 73,000 Black folks passing away because of COVID last year, if they had been a part of this program with $250,000 of insurance in place, that would have been $18 billion paid out from the life insurance companies to the families, the friends, and the businesses of those 73,000 Black people, right? But like I said, that we're moving in that direction. There's 50 billion on the books at one company. I'm looking to cross the industry now, to have other companies now buy into a larger $500 billion plan. This is something that I believe we can do for us, by us. Right? That when you look at the Black realtors with their goal for 2 million Black homes in 5 years, right? The new program to get young people to buy a home before the car, before you kill your debt to equity income ratio, with a car and your student loans. That there are programs, the Association of Black Estate Planning Professionals, ABEP, I'm on the board here. We've got a Deeds of Faith program where we're trying to make sure that everyone has a will and a trust in place for their family. So we're not losing property in like I said, Bed-Stuy. I lived in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. How many homes were lost because taxes weren't paid, or we didn't name somebody to succeed? The Hope Center has 1 million Black businesses and entrepreneurs that they're coalescing and driving and supporting. So I'm optimistic about, while these systemic changes are happening, our personal action can build and combat the current contributors to the wealth gap. That home ownership, the household income, the inheritance, things that I think we can do for ourselves in creating wealth for our children, our children's children.
Thank you.
And I'm optimistic, and hearing everyone talk. I mean, the normalization of success, the normalization of positivity, that for me is what I want to see. That's how I look at the future in terms of a world I want to live in, right? It's human nature. Unfortunately, there will be ups and downs in life, but ultimately, if it goes back to having the opportunities, having the ability to live the life that you want, that's I think that's a dream achieved for everyone. So I'm going to be really brief because my panelists before me summed up everything. The normalization of everything that has just been said, that's a beautiful thing, and we want to see more and more of that.
So I'm gonna cheat a little bit and give us 1 more minute to say if anybody has a quick round robin final thought in 1 minute, and then I'll take us home with a little quick closing statement.
I want to thank Reverend Jackson and Rainbow Push for all the work that they've done in pioneering it. I've been working with them for many years, a supporter from the New York Life side, just continuing the conversation, continuing to bring us together. I just want to acknowledge Reverend and the entire Rainbow Push team for all that they do.
Yeah, and I want to thank you, Derek, and for your tremendous facilitation on this panel, and and Kwaku and Eugene. A pleasure. But you know, I'll close out with acknowledgement that leadership matters, and we're in a day and age where courage and leadership is all too apparent. Well, authentic leadership, authentic courage. And so we talk a lot about numbers and data and economics, but leadership is important. And if we don't have leaders who will take the risk, if you will, do the right thing, you know, a lot of the gains will be lost. But I do see so many leaders of all walks of life stepping up to say, hey, we need to correct this broken system. And so for me, yes, Rainbow Push, Reverend Jackson, the leadership is undeniable. And by the way, I will say this, you know, somebody told me the other day, hey, all this stuff is happening right now. And I had to remind them, like, no, this is actually the byproduct of work. My grandmother, the woman who raised me, the Fannie Lou Hamers, the Reverend Jackson, you know, sometimes you don't see the fruit until much later. So I would challenge people who's watching this, what changes you're going to make that's going to bear fruit 20, 30 years down the road. And that's what we're working on now. When I look at everybody on this panel, we're really doing things, but to not be discouraged, because it may appear 30 years later, but it's going to appear. It's going to appear.
Yeah, and I want to acknowledge my fellow panelists. I want to acknowledge the Rainbow Push. And again, just be stubborn, have the stubbornness to never give up, have the stubbornness to know that you are entitled to what you deserve, and just keep on persevering.
So I'm going to say the society I want is one where one's race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, nativity has no transactional value in marketplace whatsoever. These things don't go away. We should celebrate our heritage and who we are, but it should have no place in market value in a transactional sense. And I think the way to get there is with, just like how we put up political rights, we need economic rights, we need well-resourced people, and we need to do it in a way where by design and implementation, we are intentional that it's anti-racist, anti-sexist. So I'm going to end by thanking Rainbow Push. Big shout out to Reverend Jackson, my fellow panelists. It is clear that y'all are committed, that y'all are doing well, and that you're doing good for everyone as well. So thank you for that. And with that, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay well and stay healthy.
Before we move forward with our very special fireside chat, let us first thank our sponsors. Most of you know that one of Rainbow Push's early and most ardent supporters is John W. Rogers Jr., Co-Chief Executive Officer and Chief Investment Officer of Ariel Investments. Reverend Jackson sat down with John Rogers, where they discussed a wide number of issues, including the increasing wealth gap, the decline of Black-owned banks, and what we must do to protect Black-owned businesses. Let's watch this fascinating conversation.
Welcome to the 24th Annual Wall Street Conference. We commemorate this year 100 years ago, Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And Ron's father owned a hotel in the Stratford Hotel 100 years ago. John, what happened?
It was a horrific thing. As you know, 100 years ago, we had this race riot. It was just totally unfair. You know, a young black man was falsely accused of assaulting a white woman in an elevator. You know, we don't think it really happened. People were afraid that this young man was going to be lynched that evening. So the black leadership came to the jailhouse to protect this young man. And my great-grandfather, J.B. Stratford, was one of the leaders in the community. So he was there. He was a part of bringing people together, and he always had a long history of speaking for economic justice and social justice in Tulsa. At the same time, he owned the Stratford Hotel, which was one of the largest black-owned hotels of the nation at the time. With all of his land, he was a millionaire already back then. And so during the Tulsa Race Massacre, they burned down his entire hotel, as we know, in the whole Greenwood section of Tulsa. And my great-grandfather had to escape Tulsa because there was real fears that they were going to arrest him and possibly lynch him because he was seen as a leader in the community.
300 people were killed. Others were sent in exile, never seen again. Several thousand.
Exactly. I know there are graves there. They're trying to find the bodies of those that were killed during the race riots. And again, luckily, fortunately, my great-grandfather was able to escape Tulsa. He got to Kansas City, where my grandfather, his son, used his legal skills to stop Tulsa from extraditing him back to Tulsa, where he could possibly be lynched.
Another Dred Scott case, huh?
It could have been. And as you know, you knew my mom very well. She told everyone that she became a lawyer, you know, the first black woman to graduate from the University of Chicago Law School. She was inspired to be a lawyer by her father using his legal skills to save his father's life. And that's why my mom became a lawyer and, you know, ultimately settled, as you know, on Greenwood Avenue in Chicago.
100 years ago. What's different today?
Well, one of the things right now, at least we're not fearful of, the fear of lynching is much less than it used to be. We know that. But when it comes to equal economic opportunity, we're no better off. You know, it's still a challenge for African-American entrepreneurs to build a business of scale and size that can last. As we know, we've lost so many of our great businesses. You know, Johnson Publishing is gone. You know, Independence Bank is gone. Seaway Bank's gone.
We've lost radio stations, TV stations in the last 20 years.
Exactly. We're going backwards. The wealth gap is much worse today than it was from our grandparents' generation. Relative to white Americans, the dean of Yale Business School has all this data that shows that we're worse off than our grandparents were relative to white Americans.
My concern now is that we've lived in 24 years since we began this project.
I think our Wall Street project's had enormous impact. You know, with the work that you've done to shine a light on the unfairness in Wall Street, how it still doesn't have the appropriate number of African Americans in leadership roles, in managing director role, partnership roles. We're still not enough black financial services companies in this country, but you've helped shine a light on it and has helped to make improvements and created opportunities for all of us. I always tell people we got one of our biggest clients, General Motors, because you introduced me to the CEO of General Motors at the Wall Street Project. And I got a conversation going with him. He added our mutual funds to their 401k plan. And literally probably 20 years later, we're still there. And it was because of your leadership and actually later on, support from other Rainbow Push leaders that kept us in there when we were having a little bit of a tough time. And people went to bat for us and fought for us because they believed in your values and believed in our values.
When we began Wall Street Project, they didn't honor Dr. King's birthday on the Wall Street Stock Exchange. They do now.
Well, that's so important. And it's so important that we honor Dr. King. And as you know, he was always on this issue of economic justice. You know, he always talked about, you know better than I, how white Americans, progressive white Americans, deplore prejudice, but accept or ignore economic injustice. You know, and that continues to be the case today, that people forget that we need to have the opportunity to fully participate in our capitalist.
We're free but not equal. Free but not have access. I call it the 4 stages of our struggle. Stage one was to end legal slavery, 246 years. Second was to end legal Jim Crow. Third, right to vote. Fourth, access to capital. We don't have access to capital.
We're making some progress with getting access to capital, but we also need access to customers, which you've always understood better than any other political leader and community leader and national leader that you are, and international leader that you are, that if we don't have customers, we can't grow our businesses. You know, you're the one that forced the grocery stores and the drugstores to have Afro Sheen and Ultra Sheen on their shelves. You know, you made sure that that happened. We need to have customers, and too many of these large, wide institutions continue to not work with Black businesses. They talk a good game, promise to do it, find every excuse not to. And so it's so important. Your voice is so critical in pushing that.
We're trying to leverage economic power. We have political power, but more economic power, and we're not using it yet effectively.
That's for sure.
We have to beg people, please vote, please vote. That's where to spend money. Stop spending so much in places that does not respect you. So the issue of access to capital is a big deal to us.
You know, I understand how important access to capital is and access to customers, but the one thing I don't understand, Reverend, is that a prior generation, when Maynard Jackson was mayor of Atlanta and Harold Washington here in Chicago, we had Coleman Young in Detroit and Marion Barry in Washington, they were all singing from your hymnal to make sure that we got economic opportunities in those great cities. We've lost a lot of that type of political leadership for some
We lost the edge.
Right.
It was a big deal for them to get Blacks with pension funds for the first time. Made them start his own financial company, right?
Right.
4 years after today, we should have access to pension funds, state, federal pension funds. Well, how much pension funds do you think our federal government has?
Oh, the federal government has, I think it's over $1 trillion, I think. Don't hold me to that, because it's.
What about 401k? What you do?
Yeah, they have a huge defined contribution plan, the equivalent of a 401k, that's, my understanding, is completely run by BlackRock. They've got one firm that manages the entire thing. But if you think of all the big contractors that work with the federal government, all the big defense companies and healthcare companies and American Airlines, United Airlines, all these folks that have been bailed out by the government still refuse to work with Blacks when it comes to professional services and financial services, for the most part. There's always an exception here or there.
We've all not raised the right questions. Given Biden's interest in development and fighting racism and all that, if he were to organize a development bank, as a citizens, there's so much bigger property than farming, urban farming in cities. But we cannot get capital to grow. If you were the big banks lend us money reluctantly, something called CEC. Mm-hmm. They're not in business to develop undeveloped ghettos. Fact of the matter, if we had a development bank, a lot of talk about the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan was 50-50 loans and 2% government secured. Development, it meant to not make money, but develop. If we had the development banks for our major cities, Blacks, Latinos, and Asian Americans, that'd be a major step in the right direction, John.
That would be the right thing. But just remember, when we get that capital, we need that customers. Because as you know, what McDonald's has done, which you've been so close to McDonald's over the years, they have 5 of the top largest Black-owned companies in this country are McDonald's suppliers. And those companies don't need capital, because when the McDonald's is buying sausages from them or croutons from them or syrups from them, they can get all the capital they need. And so you need to make sure that we get these more and more corporations to act the way McDonald's does, the way that Exelon does, the way the University of Chicago does, to work with Black businesses.
Sure, but you know, John, we also have the government, the big business, they get the tax cut to build the business, the tax break once they get the business, and then the government becomes their market. So a lot of their market is built into the institution they're lending.
Well, that's true. But when you think about these banks lending, when you talk about, the banks also spend a fortune on all kinds of products and projects. And, you know, and I've talked to your good friend Maxine Waters about this, and as chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, and her colleague Joyce Beatty, now the chairman of the Black Congressional Caucus, Black Caucus. It is just so important that they demand that these financial institutions do business with Black people. You know,
It seems to me that if we were to demand in this year's 24th Wall Street Conference, one, a development bank. Yeah, bro, it's not just for blacks. Even blacks, Latinos, and Asian Americans who are facing the racism every day, who are facing the hardships. And you get money based on your poverty level, a kind of reparations of sorts, repair the damage done. We cannot, the wealth gap is getting wider, right? If you have more have least. We can only break the cycle if we have a plan to break into the economy. We do football Super Bowl a few weeks ago, right? Everybody's excited, thought Kansas was going to win, and Tampa didn't have a chance. Tampa won the game. But when the playing field is even, you don't win the game on hype on the field. We do well in football, basketball, playing field even, rules public, goals lit, referee fair, scores transparent. Those 5 qualities must exist beyond the ball field, John.
that's for
Even playing field, public rules, field goals, scores transparent.
transparency. I'm so glad you talked about transparency because it's just so important. You know, here in our home state, Chris Welch, our new Speaker of the House, he forced all the corporations to be transparent about the lack of diversity on their boards, which I know you have been an advocate for generations. And all of a sudden, when they've had to show exactly how much lack of diversity there are in their boardrooms, they're feeling the pressure to do the right thing. And all of a sudden, Walgreens gets their only black director after Chris Welch forced the transparency here in Illinois. We're hoping in Washington, if we can start to get these big corporations, and again, Maxine and Joyce were fighting for this just last week, I think, in Washington, about getting these financial institutions to be transparent about how they spend their money.
I want to spend a little tribute to Vernon Jordan. Vernon was on many of the boards, demanded from those companies affirmative action programs. So he did some of the board. He worked on the board. Too many blacks sit on boards, but they don't make a difference.
That's for sure. You know, you and I have talked a lot about the fact that we got not only get more blacks on boards, but get blacks on boards who are going to fight for economic justice and fairness once they get in that.
You organize black board members around the country. You put some demands so when they get on the board, they kind of know what they ask for.
We've asked everybody to agree to do that and sign off on our pledge of measuring, purchasing, and people and philanthropy, the 3 Ps. But also, as you know, every year we've had a leader like yourself, the late Congressman John Lewis, Harry Belafonte, Andy Young, your old friends, all the folks who are close to Dr. King, to come to the conference, speak to the next generation of black directors and remind them that they have a responsibility to fight for economic justice in the boardroom, to live the values of Dr. King, to follow John Lewis's mantra, make good trouble once you're in that boardroom.
It seems to me that we fight for the right to vote and get leverage. We don't fight for the right of economic justice. For example, the largest business in Chicago is not the city government, not state, not federal. The largest business in Chicago is black businesses. We hire more of each other than the best hires. You have the beauty shops and barber shops and rib joints and churches. The largest employer of blacks out of the University of Chicago, Hyde Park, is Apostolic Church, hundreds of people. In Pullman, Reverend Meeks Church, House of Hope, hundreds of people they hired. Every other church hires a minister, a musician, employment matters. And now we're haberdashers and the like. We cannot get the quality product we need to make us interesting. But we will sense the size of our economic strength.
Well, we have real economic strength, but it's not what it should be, and it's not what it used to be. You know, even 20 years ago, we had 3 of the top 150 companies in Chicago were black owned. Now 0 of the top 150 companies in Chicago are black owned. You know, we've gone backwards. And you remember the days when George Johnson was running AfroSheen and UltraSheen and Johnson Products was flying high. He was working with all kinds of other black businesses. He employed 500 people. And when you came to town, he was there to support you. When Dr. King came to visit and needed money, George Johnson was there. Having that kind of...
Johnson Publishing was the same way.
Yeah, John Johnson with Johnson Publishing and all the work he did for the United Negro College Fund and black colleges and celebrating us in that magazine, which is also key. You know, putting us on the cover, putting us in those stories so people could see leaders like yourself, be inspired by your leadership.
One thing that's happened now, John, is that A lot of businesses who got money are beginning to invest in the community. Your point of having wealth is to use it to help somebody else. You have a school.
Yes. Now, the Ariel Community Academy is at 46 in Greenwood, not far from Rainbow Push. It's almost 25 years old now. 500 primarily African-American students. And we're teaching the kids about the stock market and giving them every year real money to invest in real stocks. So they get used to, accustomed to everything they need to know about Wall Street.
I know your mom and dad, you know, and your dad's Tuskegee Hammer, your mom first graduated from Chicago Law School. Christmas, they gave you stock rather than socks for Christmas. Right. What does it mean to you when you get socks as an 8, 9-year-old child?
Yeah, when I was a youngster, you know, my father insisted I get stocks instead of toys, and at first that wasn't a lot of fun. You know, instead of getting a toy, you got this little envelope. But he let me keep the dividend checks that would come in the mail every 3 months, and I became inspired and loved it. He introduced me to his stockbroker on LaSalle Street, who's a guy named Stacy Adams. He was the first African-American on LaSalle Street. He became my mentor. I would go and sit with Stacy and watch the ticker tape go by, and it changed my life. I wanted to be what Stacy was. And when I got home from college, that's what I became a stockbroker, just like Stacy Adams.
What was striking me about we teach children stock market game. One day there was the Chicago Stock Exchange, and we had these children there. I say children 13, 15 years old. And so we would get each of them a T-shirt. And the one little girl wouldn't put a T-shirt on. We thought she'd be belligerent. I'm not going to put a T-shirt on. Well, we didn't know how to handle it. So we said, what? She says, the TV camera? She said, yes. So I want to advertise my stock. I buy old Navy. I'm kind of big for my size. She should learn the value of stocks. And too many of us see stocks raised as somebody wrap fish in. But put a little appreciation of the stock market.
Right. We got to get people to appreciate it. You know, what we used to do every year when Don Thompson was the CEO of McDonald's, every year we'd take 40 kids from the Ariel Community Academy. They go to the annual meeting, like you've been to the annual meeting. Kids would sit in the annual meeting. One kid would get an ask a question. And then afterwards, they would spend an hour with Don and his wife, Liz, learning about how he became CEO of McDonald's and what the annual meeting was all about. And we need that kind of leadership. We need those role models that we've just...
At the Wall Street Project, we're having sessions like that. We're also having sessions with how we become investment brokers. Like one thing happened at Wall Street, Bill Clinton was there and Sandy Weill was there. And they decided to give a black, they first started underwriting a $1 billion deal, right? In the morning, and Blaylock won the deal. Did so well, other blacks began to get the $1 billion deals because of our insistence, because of our pressure. We should apply that pressure, John.
Your pressure is so critical. And as we said earlier, we've got to make sure we get elected officials who are going to back you up and support you. And then the next generation of leaders, these venture capital guys and hedge fund guys who are making hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, they've got to be supporting you.
It seems to me that one thing that we missed, we must address, is know what to ask for. One of the values you had at your annual conference of leaders, what to ask for. Right now, given Biden's disposition toward racial justice and inclusion, we should know precisely how much pension funds there are. Well, I shall have pension funds to invest. I shall to invest 401k, because we'll contribute taxes and representation in Washington, for example. We'll contribute to the taxes and the pension funds that tell us we're investment unworthy. UAW workers, for example, auto workers. Those who have the money will invest in the ghetto by and large. They say, well, the money comes from them, but we live as investment unworthy. That's a very subjective notion, you know. So the trust property in America is now vacant. The rise of 1968, still vacant. They're trying to plant corn and vegetables in those places. That's for the businesses, because there's a fourth stage of our capital is an interesting stage. We've had slavery, 246 years. Jim Crow, another 80 years. Segregation after that, right to vote. Now that's the capital. We must demand our share of capital. If every state, if we got our share of pension funds to invest, in every state, federal government, our share of 401k, we'd have capital, because it's our share of capital.
Exactly. If we could get our opportunities to fully participate in the wealth building parts of our economy. You and I have talked about the fact also we have this term supplier diversity, which means that well-meaning people will only give us a chance to do supply chain work, which is important. Construction, catering, janitorial service, those are important industries. But the wealth and power today are on Wall Street, Silicon Valley, professional services. That's where people are making the real money, and that's what
With Silicon Valley, they had 185 white board members, 36 white women, 3 blacks, 1 Latino. Now blacks on the board of Apple and Facebook and all that. Because I work in Silicon Valley. But and Jim Bell, at Apple, he's leveraging because he understands business, make it happen.
I remember you had all those visits to Silicon Valley and made such a difference. And and you work closely with Black Enterprise that helped create all the data that we needed to be able to show the lack of diversity there. But if you hadn't shown up, it would still be the way it is.
Black Enterprise is a great outlet for us. I miss Jet so much and evidence so much. Jack, if you were in the military in Australia, Africa, or wherever, you Jet magazine. We don't have a Jet magazine.
It's heartbreaking, huh?
And Mateo was lynched. There was a couple. The Chicago Defender made such an issue of it, and Jet's was biggest magazines covered Emmett Till's defaced body. 100,000 came to business because black press had a role to play, and they played it magnificently.
It's just so heartbreaking to lose Ebony and Jet. And as you know, that headquarters building was so powerful, such a powerful symbol for black entrepreneurship around the world.
11 stories high. John won the 33-story building. They wouldn't lend them on Michigan Avenue. So he had to produce his own money. Herman Russell in Atlanta has built this nice restaurant, first class and hotel. He wanted to have a bigger hotel. Citizenship Bank had to put up his own money. So there's still a certain notion about black in business. So some of us don't believe in black businesses. Don't appreciate its impact.
I know. It has such an influence, and that's my other hero, is Maynard Jackson, and he transformed Atlanta, because he built up a black business community.
Airports, $6 billion a year business in Atlanta. He stopped up a building to include blacks in the trades, as well as the ones in the board. You have pastors is in Atlanta Airport. Black business handling business inside the airport.
You're right, and as you know, when he first got elected, he realized that none of the banks in Atlanta had blacks on the board. He called in all those bankers and said, "You're not going to be able to do business here in Atlanta unless you have a black person on your board." And sure enough, within weeks, all those banks had their first black board member because Maynard insisted. That's the kind of intentional leadership that he brought and made such a difference.
Well, I'm convinced now that since Biden is president, $3 trillion better infrastructure, we must now demand access to investment capital, pension funds and university pension funds. Universities are notorious, right? Name some of them. Harvard, they won't let us manage that money.
Well, they're making progress, under the pressure they're getting from Congress, again, progressive leaders like Maxine and Joyce and Congressman Cleaver and Congressman Kennedy, yourself. Others are forcing these universities to do more, and they're starting to do it. Finally, some of them are using black managers for their endowments.
They shouldn't react to us because, including the growth, everybody wins. I mean, we came to football and reacted, now everybody's winning. Basketball, everybody's winning. Because when we get in, it doesn't hurt everybody, it helps everybody.
That's for sure. And as my father always said, you got to live up to the commitments you make to others. These institutions have made commitments that they care about diversity and inclusion, but they haven't been living those values.
I want people to come to Wall Street and share. Hit us online, rainbowpush.org. You hit Wall Street and get how to connect with us. The point is that we need you around the nation. Now we have blacks, 60 black. When we started this at 10 blacks in Congress, there's 60 in the Congress. We're here in major committees, House. Now you got Warnock in the Senate. We lost Kamala Harris, who was vice president. Not a bad loss, huh?
No.
She's doing a tremendous job too.
Yep.
She's so able. He gave her that assignment to handle the border conflict. As Attorney General for California, she handled the border conflict, but for dealers, she understands the dynamics of it. And so the good news politically, nothing we can't do.
I know. I'm optimistic. I'm starting to get optimistic.
President, vice president, we censor. We must leverage that habit to get our share of capital. Because if you're big and somebody says that's right, you write your paycheck. You're never free. We're free, we're not equal. We're free.
But just remember, I know I keep coming back to it, but just think about these big airlines that do business with the federal government, the big defense contractors, the big healthcare companies. You know, someone tells me Lockheed Martin has a $98 billion pension plan. If they're doing business with the federal government should insist that they do business with Black people with everything they do.
We have to demand it. I'm not convinced when a popular election going to Washington, you know about where economic money is buried. These companies, they get tax subsidies to build the company, they get tax cuts, they get tax breaks. The government is their customer. They can't fail. That's not capitalism. That's a kind of enlightened socialism up top, right?
Right. Yep. And these subsidize all these universities, all these hospitals, all these museums get direct subsidies from the federal government and the local governments.
We'll be demanding at this conference. We get the state by state with us, transparent pension monies, government and universities and private corporations. Particularly those that we have leverage on because of the tax government policies. We want a development bank. I'll meet with Secretary Yellen as soon as we can. The development bank is a smart idea. Because the wealth gap is working, we can't get access to money. That's to degrees, but Blacks with degrees are still on the work, on the paid. So I think the pandemic should have shown that these disparities, they're not natural, these are social disparities.
And again, we've been hurt the worst in this pandemic because we have these service jobs. You think about it, construction, catering, janitorial services, those are the businesses that went out of businesses during the financial crisis. Those local restaurants and local dry cleaners and things like that. The folks doing private equity and hedge funds and partners in law firms are sitting up in their offices or sitting at home making just as much money at home as if they were in their offices.
Ted Turner told me one time, "Ted, why did you give you $1 billion?" He said, "Well, I thought I should do it." Why? It was the right thing to do. CNN is already in those countries. He said he went to bed one night, he's a billionaire. Woke up the next morning, he was $3 billion. He gave $1 billion he never had to year-end. Right. Because money, they said money grows on trees if it's planted in money mud. If your money can work while you sleep, while you're age, if you invest in stock, you make right choices. There are always consequences of bad decisions, but right choices, right decisions, you can grow.
Exactly, and that's what we've been left out of. We haven't had that opportunity to have multi-generational wealth and live off the dividends of what grandma, grandma created, you know. We've been left out of those opportunities because of what you suggested, because of the segregation, because of the Jim Crow laws. We didn't create a chance to build wealth that can go down and be passed down generation to generation.
Separate equal meant that we were separate, but we were on the scorcher side of the equation. So we were separated, but we could not separate from access to capital, banks, insurance companies, and lending, separated from military protection. So the hoodlums just burned up Tulsa 100 years ago, case in point, and we couldn't even make money with our own community at that time. Now we have more freedom, we have more political power. Our demand structure must be, that's what this conference is about this week. We're demanding our share of pension funds. I keep sharing pension funds because that money's just there. It's our money. Right. All the workers is our money. Service workers is our money. Airline, it's our money. So when we meet with the president, we have to demand that we know how much pension funds there are. To get our share of pension funds, it'd be a lot of money, wouldn't it?
It'd be a lot. And it'd be a lot. We would all of us in financial services would be in a whole other category. Our businesses would be double our size, triple our size.
On your company, Ariel Capital, describe your capital. What do you do? How have you grown, sir?
Well, Ariel, we have about $17 billion under management. But it's in two areas. One is we do manage pension plans and parts of endowments where we take a portion of large pools of capital and invest it. Our specialty is the stock market, and we invest in international and global investing in small and mid-cap value stocks. That's what we've been doing for a long, long time. The second business is we have our mutual funds that are available for individual investors and can be added to any 401k plan in the country, can be a part of any financial advisory's financial advisors menu when they're talking to their wealthy customers, their individual customers.
People who are watching you today, what can they do to help Ariel?
What they can do is when they go to work, say, why isn't Ariel Mutual Funds on our platform at the 401k? Why isn't it one of the options in our 401k?
We have a list of companies.
Yeah.
Ariel's not in the list.
Exactly.
If they knew Ariel was in the list, they could choose Ariel.
Exactly. Just like, you push grocery, I use that example all the time. You push grocery stores that put Black products on the shelves so the Black consumers could pick those products along with Coke and Pepsi and all the other big brands. Well, people with their 401k, they got Vanguard or Fidelity or T. Rowe Price, these big giant companies. Ariel Fund should be one of those options for employees. So people go to work and say, we care about diversity and inclusion, but none of our fund options are Black owned.
I raise this because some of us don't know to ask what you're talking about. When we do the access pension funds, I keep pension funds because so much money is in pension funds. I mean, what they've done, Cal Spurs.
Cal Stirs and Cal Pers. Yeah.
Man, the kind of money they've invested, it's our money. We're not demanding it. So I want to thank you for having this conversation today. I want many Black board members who are watching on board, something because of our work. Support us in our efforts to make a difference. We're going to spend a lot of time this year on the development bank idea, the development bank, the idea of effective use of our monies to invest them, the green line, the red line zone. And if we may or may not, it may run us out of politics. We have every product on the store, we have a margin of profit. We negotiate with anybody. No company can survive without our investment.
So important the work you're doing, Reverend.
Chain store has 15,000 products. Every product in that store needs us.
Well, we need you, right? We need you, and we got to get all of our folks to be involved and engaged with PUSH. I talk about it all the time, how important your work is, and people need to be there, show up, write their checks, be supportive, and tell friends to come. It's just, it's in their own interest.
RainbowPush.org, and hit money. Hit Wall Street. Just thank you for sharing today your grandfather's story, your story. While you're so rich, you couldn't help it, huh? The legacy of it. Your grandfather was a hotel owner in Tulsa. His son freed him, saved him from being lynched. Your mother succeeded him. And so that legacy of family, 4 generations. Most of us don't have 4 generations. And thank you for being, and thank you, John, you don't have to be as decent as you are. You've been blessed to have access to wealth all your life. You act like a poor man. You come to Black churches, go to Black events. You're not too busy to be with us. And you built a school with 500 students. And they're doing very well in college because they're getting good education. Your students have computers. One thing we're going to do, we're now in Chicago. Chicago jails have precinct inside the jail for voting. UCF is going to try to now put in the jails computers. Those children on something 3 to 5 years on pretrial detention. And they are playing cards. They should be playing stock market. You learn how to use computers, apps. So one thing Rainbow Push does is we supply computers to young people to learn apps, codes, and programming. There are too few of them in the country. Come out of jail with you do apps and codes and programming, you get a job. There are more jobs than there are people. You get my point? Mm-hmm. So the jail youth will do another project called Concordia in Chicago. Concordia is 400 people, 400 units, 300 Black women, maybe 10 Black men. The government, if you've been in jail, you or your son, you can't come home. Black men can't, if we lock Black men away from home, we want that to happen. They must fix the projects now. We can be construction companies. We can rebuild where we live. The housing full of mold and people getting asthma and dying. Black women in the main are struggling. And yet, in the year of the woman, Black women matter. Poor Black women must be part of the agenda. So in the Wall Street project here, we're going to focus a lot on 4 stages: access, capital, industry, technology, and deal flow. And you're in the middle of it. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Bless you guys. We're going to have a great Wall Street conference this year. Beyond the conference this year, our share of money. We will get our share of pension funds, corporate pension funds, university pension funds, become investors, and when we do that, we'll grow. Thank you, John.
It's an honor to be here.
Thank you both, and thank you all for spending time with us on the first day of our summit. We end today's summit with another shout out to our sponsors.